I am just a chronicler and welcome you to another video. Since I know many of you watch to relax and fall asleep, I thought it would be nice if you left a comment telling me where you're listening from and if it's raining there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Now, it's time to get comfortable, relax, and begin. The scratching started on our second night in the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the pine needles against the roof. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening, I realized it was coming from inside the walls. Let me back up a bit. My name's Sarah, and I'd planned this trip as a surprise for my husband Mike's birthday. Our kids, Ethan and Zoe, had been begging for a real adventure all summer, so I figured a long weekend in a rustic cabin would be perfect. When I found the listing online, secluded Pine Haven, your own private forest retreat, I knew I'd struck gold. The drive up had been gorgeous. As we wound our way deeper into the national forest, the trees pressed in closer on both sides of the road. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the pavement with shifting patterns of light and shadow. How much further? Ethan whined from the back seat for the 100th time. I glanced at the GPS. Should be just around this bend, kiddo. Mike shot me a smile as he navigated the curving forest road. This was a great idea, hon. We really needed to unplug for a few days. As we rounded the corner, the cabin came into view. It was everything the listing had promised. A charming A-frame nestled in a small clearing, weathered wood siding silvered with age. A rustic porch wrapped around the front, complete with a pair of rocking chairs that looked perfect for sipping morning coffee. Wow, Zoe pressed her face to the window. It's like something out of a fairy tale. We piled out of the car, stretching and breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. The only sounds were birdsong and the whisper of wind through the treetops. It felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. Inside, the cabin was cozy and inviting. Knotty pine walls gave it a warm, golden glow. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the open-plan living area, with a plush sofa and armchairs gathered around it. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, and a steep staircase led up to a loft bedroom. Ethan and Zoe immediately claimed the pair of twin beds tucked under the eaves. That first evening was pure magic. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the fire pit in the backyard, swapping stories and laughing as the sky faded from blue to dusky purple. As night fell, the stars came out in dazzling profusion, more than I'd ever seen in the city. Look, a shooting star. Zoe pointed excitedly. Make a wish, Mike said, pulling her close. I wished for more perfect moments like this one. When we finally headed inside, pleasantly stuffed with s'mores and smelling of wood smoke, I felt a deep contentment settle over me. This was exactly what our family needed. That contentment lasted right up until I jolted awake in the pitch darkness, unsure what had disturbed me. I lay still, listening. The cabin creaked and settled around us, but there was something else. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere inside the walls. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I nudged Mike. Hey, do you hear that? He mumbled sleepily. Hear what? I strained my ears, but the sound had stopped. Never mind, probably just the wind. But lying there in the darkness, I couldn't shake a creeping sense of unease. It felt like the shadows in the corners of the room had grown deeper, more watching. I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I knew, early morning sunlight was streaming through the windows. The uneasy feeling from the night before seemed silly in the cheerful light of day. I headed downstairs to start coffee, enjoying the quiet before the rest of the family woke up. As the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the kitchen, I noticed something odd. The fruit bowl on the counter wasn't where I remembered leaving it the night before. I could have sworn it had been by the sink, but now it was in the center of the table. Huh? I shrugged it off. I must have moved it without thinking. The day passed in a blur of hiking, swimming in the nearby lake, and exploring the woods around the cabin. By the time we trudged back, pleasantly worn out, the fruit bowl incident was forgotten. That night, I woke again to the scratching sound. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall, right beside our bed. "Mike," I whispered urgently. "Wake up. Listen." He sat up instantly alert. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know. I heard it last night too." We sat in tense silence, listening to the rhythmic scratching. It went on for several long minutes before gradually fading away. Mike got up and flicked on the lights, checking the walls. "I don't see anything. Probably just a raccoon or something in the walls." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. Something about the sound had seemed almost deliberate. "Should we call the property manager?" I asked. Mike shook his head. "No, it's the middle of the night. If it happens again tomorrow, we'll give him a call." I tried to go back to sleep, but I lay awake for a long time, jumping at every little noise. The next morning, things got weirder. "Mum," Zoe called from the loft. "Did you come up here last night?" I climbed the stairs, frowning. "No, honey. Why?" She pointed to the twin beds. Both had been stripped, the sheets and blankets folded into neat piles at the foot of each bed. "We didn't do this," Ethan said. He looked scared. A chill ran down my spine. "It's okay, guys. You probably just did it in your sleep. Let's get these remade." But as I helped them put the sheets back on, my mind was racing. I knew for a fact the beds had been unmade when the kids went to sleep last night. All day, I felt on edge. I kept noticing little things out of place. A chair moved slightly, a book on a different shelf, the doors to all the kitchen cabinets standing open when I knew I'd closed them. Each time, I told myself there must be a reasonable explanation, but doubt gnawed at me. That evening, we were playing a board game when the lights flickered, then went out entirely. Zoe yelped. Ethan's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. "It's okay," Mike said calmly. "Probably just a blown fuse. I'll go check." "I'll come with you," I said quickly. The thought of him going off alone in the dark cabin filled me with nameless dread. We felt our way to the kitchen, where we'd seen a flashlight earlier. Mike flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Together, we made our way to the basement door. I hesitated at the top of the stairs. The beam of the flashlight seemed swallowed by the absolute blackness below. "Maybe we should both stay up here with the kids," I suggested. Mike squeezed my hand. "It'll be fine." Back in a jiffy. I watched the bouncing flashlight beam descend the stairs, my heart pounding. The seconds stretched into minutes. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the muffled voices of the kids from the other room. Just as I was about to call out to Mike, the lights blazed back to life. I blinked in the sudden brightness. Got it. Mike's voice floated up from below. Fuse box was right where they said it would be. I sagged with relief. "See," I told myself, "there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything." But that night, the scratching came again. This time, it wasn't just from one wall. It was all around us, a frenzied cacophony of scraping and clawing that seemed to come from every direction at once. I clutched Mike's arm. "We need to get the kids and go, now." He nodded, face pale in the darkness. We hurried to the loft, shaking Ethan and Zoe awake. "We're going on a little drive," I said. trying to keep my voice steady. Adventure time. As Mike hustled them down the stairs, I grabbed our bags, shoving clothes in haphazardly. The scratching was getting louder, more frantic. We piled into the car, hearts racing. As Mike turned the key, the scratching abruptly stopped. In the sudden silence, I looked back at the cabin. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a face in the darkened window, pale, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Then Mike threw the car into reverse, and the cabin disappeared from view. We drove through the night in silence, the kids dozing in the back seats. As the first pink light of dawn touched the sky, we pulled into a roadside diner. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Mike and I tried to make sense of what had happened. "We'll call the property manager," he said. "Let them know. Something's not right with the place." I nodded, but I knew we'd never be able to fully explain what we'd experienced. The crawling dread, the feeling of being watched, the sense that the cabin itself was somehow alive and malevolent. As we got back on the road, heading home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd had a narrow escape. From what, I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing. Our next family vacation would be at a nice, normal hotel, with lots of other people around. I glanced in the rearview mirror at Ethan and Zoe, peacefully asleep in the back seat. A wave of fierce protectiveness washed over me. We were safe now. We'd gotten out. But as we merged onto the highway, a chill ran down my spine. For just a moment, I could have sworn I heard a faint, familiar sound over the rush of the wind and the hum of the tires on pavement. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Story 2. The moment we stepped off the marked trail, I felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, just a whisper of unease that brushed the back of my neck. If I'd known then what I know now, I'd have turned us around right there. But hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? "Come on, Alex, where's your sense of adventure?" My best friend Jake grinned at me, already pushing through the underbrush. I hesitated, glancing back at the well-worn path we were leaving behind. "You sure about this?" The ranger at the visitor center was pretty clear about sticking to marked trails. Jake rolled his eyes. "That's just liability talk. Besides, look at this." He pulled out his phone, showing me a grainy image of a stunning waterfall cascading into a crystal-clear pool. Some guy in an online hiking forum swears this is just a couple miles off the main trail. Imagine having a place like that all to ourselves. I had to admit, it did look amazing. And hey, we were experienced hikers. What could go wrong? If only I'd known. We set off, the dense foliage quickly swallowing up any sign of the main trail. The forest here felt different. Older, somehow. The trees grew close together, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so thick it was like twilight on the forest floor. "Check it out," Jake said, pointing to a tree trunk. A strange symbol had been carved into the bark, a circle with a jagged line through it. Maybe it's a trail marker. I frowned. Something about the symbol made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I guess. Let's keep an eye out for more. As we pressed deeper into the woods, I noticed more of the symbols appearing on trees and rocks. They varied slightly, but all had that same unsettling quality. Some looked freshly carved, the pale wood still visible in the cuts. Others were weathered and old, almost consumed by the bark growing around them. "Jake," I said, my voice low, "don't you think it's weird that these marks are everywhere, but there's no actual trail? No footprints, no trampled vegetation?" He shrugged, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Maybe we just haven't found the right path yet." The forum guy said it was tricky to find. We pushed on, the forest growing denser with each step. The air felt thick and close, carrying strange scents I couldn't identify. Twice, I could have sworn I heard something moving in the underbrush, just out of sight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours of hiking, Jake called for a water break. We found a fallen log to sit on, the moss damp beneath our hands. As I took a long drink from my water bottle, I realized something odd. "Hey, Jake," I said slowly. "What time did we leave the main trail?" He glanced at his watch, then frowned. "That can't be right. According to this, we've only been hiking for 45 minutes. I pulled out my phone to check, but the screen was black. Dead battery. Weird. I could have sworn I'd charged it fully before we left." Jake was tapping at his watch in frustration. "Damn thing must be broken. No way, we've only been out here less than an hour." A tendril of dread curled in my stomach. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the forest seemed to shift and blur at the edges of my vision. None of the landmarks looked familiar. Even the sun, what little I could see of it through the canopy, seemed to be in the wrong part of the sky. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep the growing panic out of my voice. "We can always try again another day." Jake nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, good call. This place is starting to give me the creeps." We turned around, retracing our steps. Or at least, we tried to. But nothing looked familiar. The symbols on the trees seemed to mock us, leading us in circles. Twice we found ourselves back at the same fallen log where we'd taken our break. "This is impossible," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We can't be lost. We're experienced hikers, for Christ's sake." I was about to respond when a sound stopped me cold. A low, rhythmic chanting drifted through the trees. It was faint, but unmistakably human. Jake's eyes widened. "Do you hear that, people? Maybe they can help us." Before I could stop him, he was off, crashing through the underbrush toward the sound. I had no choice but to follow. We burst into a small clearing, panting, and froze. The chanting cut off abruptly. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of rough stone pillars, each one carved with those same unnerving symbols we'd been seeing. But it was what was inside the circle that made my blood run cold. A group of people stood there, dressed in what looked like animal skins and elaborate wooden masks. They were completely still, every masked face turned toward us. For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Then one of the figures stepped forward. Its mask was intricately carved to resemble a snarling wolf, antlers sprouting from its brow. "Welcome, travelers," it said, its voice a dry rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been expecting you." Jake found his voice first. You have." The masked figure tilted its head, an unnaturally fluid motion. "Of course. The forest told us you were coming. It always knows." I grabbed Jake's arm, every instinct screaming at me to run. But my feet felt rooted to the ground. We're lost," I managed to say. "We're just trying to get back to the main trail." A sound like dry leaves rustling emanated from behind the wolf mask. It took me a moment to realize it was laughter. "Oh, but you're not lost at all," the figure said. "You're exactly where you're meant to be. The forest has chosen you." The other masked figures began to move then, spreading out to encircle us. I could hear Jake's breathing growing rapid and shallow beside me. "Chosen us for what?" he asked, his voice cracking. The wolf-masked figure reached up and slowly removed its mask. What was underneath? I still have trouble describing it. It was like a face, but wrong somehow. Features that shifted and blurred when you tried to focus on them. Eyes that were too bright, too aware. For the renewal, of course, it said, smiling with too many teeth. The forest hungers, and you will feed it. Everything happened very fast after that. The circle closed in. Jake screamed. I tried to run, but roots erupted from the earth, wrapping around my ankles. I don't remember much after that. Flashes, fragments, the taste of dirt and blood in my mouth, the sound of Jake's voice growing fainter, the feeling of being pulled down into the damp earth. When I came to, I was alone, lying on my back on the forest floor, staring up at a canopy of leaves that seemed to pulse with an inner light. My clothes were caked with mud, my body aching in ways I couldn't begin to describe. I staggered to my feet, my head spinning. "Jake," I called out, my voice hoarse. "Jake," but there was no answer. Just the whisper of wind through leaves that sounded almost like laughter. I wandered for what felt like days, though the sun never seemed to move in the sky. The forest around me felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before. Watchful, hungry. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch glimpses of those masked figures flitting between the trees. But when I turned to look, they were gone. Finally, miraculously, I stumbled out onto the main trail. A group of hikers found me, dehydrated and babbling about masks and living trees. They called for help, and soon I was wrapped in a blanket in the back of a ranger's truck, being asked questions I couldn't begin to answer. Where was my friend? What happened to us? How long had we been out there? I told them everything, or at least, I tried to. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see the disbelief in their eyes. The pitying looks they exchanged when they thought I couldn't see. They searched for Jake, of course, but they never found a trace of him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, or been swallowed by the earth itself. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear his voice on the wind, calling my name, begging for help. But that's crazy talk, right? It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, the taste of dirt in my mouth. The doctors say it's PTSD, that my mind is trying to make sense of a traumatic experience. They've got me on all sorts of medications, and most days I can almost believe them. But then I'll catch sight of a certain arrangement of branches, or a pattern in the grain of wood, and for a split second, I'll see those symbols again. A circle with a jagged line. A promise. A warning. The forest is still out there, waiting, hungry. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I find myself longing to go back. To step off the marked path once more and lose myself in those shadowed woods. After all, the forest chose me once. Who's to say it won't choose me again? Story 3. The first time I heard the footsteps, I dismissed them as the building settling. By the third time, I knew something was terribly wrong. But let me start at the beginning, back when staying late at the office seemed like a good idea. I'm Emma, and I've always been the overachiever type. So when my boss mentioned a big presentation coming up, I volunteered to put in extra hours to make sure everything was perfect. That's how I found myself alone on the 14th floor of Pinnacle Tower at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, surrounded by the eerie quiet of a usually bustling office. At first, I kind of enjoyed the solitude. No ringing phones, no chattering co-workers, just the soft hum of my computer and the occasional ping of the elevator down the hall. I got into a groove, fingers flying over my keyboard as I fine-tuned our pitch deck. It was around 10:30 when I first noticed something off. A soft shuffling sound, like someone walking on carpet, coming from the far end of the floor. I paused, cocking my head to listen. Nothing but silence. "Get it together, Emma," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I turned back to my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper somehow, more watching. I shook my head, trying to focus on the screen in front of me. Another hour ticked by. I was deep in a spreadsheet when movement caught the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty bullpen, workstations dark and silent. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. Okay, that's it. Time for a coffee break. I stood up, stretching muscles stiff from hours of sitting. The break room was on the other side of the floor, past rows of cubicles in the elevator bank. As I walked, my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The break room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the vending machines. I flipped on the lights, blinking in the sudden brightness. As the ancient coffee maker gurgled to life, I leaned against the counter, trying to shake off the weird vibes. That's when I heard it. Clear as day, the sound of footsteps coming down the hall towards the break room. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I was alone on this floor. I'd watched the last of my co-workers leave hours ago. Hello? I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. Is someone there? No response. The footsteps stopped. I peeked out into the hallway, half expecting to see the night janitor. But there was no one there, just the empty corridor stretching into darkness. My hands trembled as I poured my coffee. This was ridiculous. I was a grown woman, for crying out loud. There was no reason to be scared of an empty office. But as I hurried back to my desk, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of my mug, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the shadows. Back at my desk, I tried to lose myself and work again, but every little noise made me jump. The hum of the AC kicking on, the ping of an incoming email, the soft whir of my computer fan. It was almost midnight when the elevator dinged. I froze, fingers hovering over my keyboard. There was no reason for anyone else to be here this late. Slowly, I stood up, peering over the top of my cubicle towards the elevator bank. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh, but no one stepped out. I watched, heart pounding, as the empty car sat there for a long moment before the doors closed again. Okay, that's it, I said aloud, trying to inject some confidence into my voice. Time to call it a night. I started shutting down my computer, hands shaking slightly as I gathered my things. That's when the lights flickered. Once, twice, plunging the office into momentary darkness, before humming back to life. In those brief seconds of blackness, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the end of the row of cubicles. But when the lights came back on, there was nothing there. I practically ran to the elevator, jabbing the down button repeatedly. Come on, I muttered. The soft ding announcing its arrival made me jump. As the doors slid open, I hesitated. What if whatever I thought I'd seen was in there? But the car was empty. I stepped inside, hitting the button for the lobby with more force than necessary. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the polished metal. A dark shape just behind me. I whirled around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just my own pale, frightened face staring back at me. The ride down to the lobby was the longest 30 seconds of my life. I kept my eyes fixed on the numbers ticking down, willing them to move faster. 12, 11, 10. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I burst out, startling the night security guard at his desk. "Whoa there," he said, standing up. "Everything okay, miss?" I tried to calm my breathing, suddenly feeling foolish. "Yeah, sorry. Just working late." Spooked myself, I guess. He nodded sympathetically. Happens to the best of us. This old building can play tricks on your mind when it's quiet. As I hurried out to the parking garage, his words echoed in my head. Tricks on your mind. That's all it was. I was tired, stressed about the presentation. My brain was just conjuring up imaginary threats. But as I drove home, hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that office with me. Something that didn't want me there. I slept fitfully that night, dreams filled with shadowy figures and endless, maze-like corridors. When my alarm went off the next morning, I seriously considered calling in sick. But the thought of letting my team down was even scarier than what I'd experienced the night before. So I dragged myself back to Pinnacle Tower, clutching an extra-large coffee like a lifeline. The office was its usual bustling self, full of Monday morning chatter and the clacking of keyboards. In the bright light of day, my fears from the night before seemed silly. I threw myself into work, determined to put it behind me. But as the day wore on, I kept noticing little things that set me on edge. A chair in the conference room that I could have sworn was pushed in, now pulled out slightly. The break room fridge door standing open when no one had been in there for at least an hour. My desktop wallpaper changed to an image I didn't recognize. Each time, I told myself there must be a logical explanation, but doubt gnawed at me. As the workday wound down, my boss stopped by my desk. Great job on that presentation, Emma. The client loved it. Listen, I've got another project I could use your help on. Any chance you could stay late again tonight? My mouth went dry. The thought of being alone in the office again filled me with dread. But how could I explain that to my boss without sounding crazy? Sure, I heard myself say. No problem, single quotes, he beamed. Knew I could count on you. I'll email you the details. As my co-workers filtered out each cheery good night, felt like another nail in my coffin. Soon, I was alone again, the silence of the empty office pressing in around me. I tried to focus on work, but every little noise made me flinch. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed abnormally loud. Tap, 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 like footsteps. No. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Not footsteps. Just the clock. But there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Definitely not the clock this time. It was coming from down the hall, growing louder. My heart raced as I peered over my cubicle wall. The hallway was dark, the motion sensor lights having clicked off from lack of movement. But in the dim emergency lighting, I could just make out a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and it was coming towards me with a jerky, uneven gait. I ducked down, biting back a scream. This couldn't be happening. I was imagining things. I had to be. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, rattling breath. It sounded close. Too close. Slowly, I raised my head, peering over the cubicle wall again. The figure stood at the end of my row, its featureless face turned towards me. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, with a sound like dry leaves scraping against concrete, it smiled. A wide, toothless gash spreading across its face. I ran. Out of my cubicle, down the hall, my feet pounding against the carpet. I could hear it behind me, that awful rattling breath growing closer. I slammed into the stairwell door, taking the steps 2 at a time. My lungs burned, legs aching, but terror drove me on. I burst out onto the street, gasping for air. Passers-by stared, but I didn't care. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing onto a bench in a nearby park. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, my phone buzzed. A text from my boss. "Everything okay? Saw you run out of the building on the security cams. Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message, my mind reeling. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? With shaking hands, I typed out a reply. "Sorry, wasn't feeling well. Heading home to rest." As I hit send, I realized something. I couldn't go back there. Not to that office, not to that job. Whatever was in that building, it wasn't natural, and it wanted something from me. I looked up at the night sky, the stars obscured by city lights. For the first time in my life, I had no plan, no next step. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from Pinnacle Tower as possible. As I stood up on shaky legs, a chill ran down my spine. In the reflection of a nearby shop window, just for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a tall, misshapen figure standing behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty park bench and the distant sound of traffic. But I knew better now. I knew that just because you couldn't see something, didn't mean it wasn't there. Watching, waiting. I turned and walked away, never looking back. But even now, months later and hundreds of miles away, I still sometimes hear that tap, tap, tap in my dreams. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or is it still out there, following me, biding its time until we meet again? Story 4. The first red flag should have been the eagerness in his eyes when he pulled over. But when you're stranded on a lonely stretch of highway at midnight, beggars can't be choosers. At least, that's what I told myself as I watched him pop the hood of my car. I had no idea then that this seemingly kind stranger was about to turn my world upside down. It all started with a road trip. My sister's wedding was in 2 days, and I was making the long drive from Chicago to Denver. I'd been on the road for hours, the monotonous landscape of eastern Colorado blurring past my windows. The radio kept me company, some late-night talk show host droning on about conspiracy theories. That's when I heard it. A sputtering cough from under the hood, followed by an ominous rattle. "No, no, no," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But it was no use. The engine gave one final wheeze and died, leaving me coasting to a stop on the shoulder. I sat there for a moment, forehead resting on the steering wheel. "Come on, Lisa," I said to myself. "You can handle this." But as I stepped out of the car, the reality of my situation hit me. Nothing but empty fields and darkness in every direction. No streetlights, no houses, not even another car on the road. I pulled out my phone, already knowing what I'd see. No signal, of course. That's when I saw the headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded through me. Maybe this Good Samaritan could at least call for a tow truck. The car slowed as it approached, finally pulling over about 20 feet behind me. In the glow of the headlights, I could make out the shape of an old pickup truck, its once red paint now a dusty rust color. A man stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights. "Car trouble," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. It just died on me. "Don't suppose you know anything about cars?" He chuckled, walking towards me. As he got closer, I could make out more details. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of a life of manual labor. "Been working on engines since I was knee-high to a grasshopper," he said. "Name's Earl. Let's take a look, shall we?" I introduced myself as he peered under the hood, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the tangle of wires and metal. He muttered. "Might be your alternator." Easy enough to fix if you've got the part. But I'm guessing you don't carry spare alternators around. I shook my head, feeling helpless. Is there a town nearby? Somewhere I could get it towed? Earl scratched his chin thoughtfully. Nearest town's about 40 miles back. But tell you what, I've got a whole mess of spare parts back at my place. It's just a few miles down the road. Why don't I tow you there, and we can get you fixed up? A wave of unease washed over me. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. Young woman, alone on a deserted road, trusting a stranger. It never ended well. But what choice did I have? It's not like I could sleep in my car and wait for morning. And Earl seemed harmless enough. Just a kind old man trying to help. That would be great, I heard myself say. Thank you so much. Earl's face broke into a wide grin, revealing a gold tooth. Happy to help, Miss Graff. Let me just get my tow rope, as he hitched my car to his truck. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on me a bit too long, or the slight tremor in his hands that didn't match his confident demeanor. We set off down the dark highway, my dead car trailing behind us. Earl kept up a steady stream of small talk, asking about my trip, my family, where I was from. I gave vague answers, not wanting to reveal too much. Not much further now, Earl said, after about 15 minutes of driving. He turned onto a narrow dirt road, barely visible in the darkness. The truck bumped and jolted as we made our way down the rutted path. Finally, a structure loomed out of the darkness. As we got closer, I could make out a ramshackle farmhouse, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. Next to it stood a large barn, its doors wide open. "Home sweet home," Earl announced, pulling up in front of the barn. "Let's get your car inside where we can work on it properly." As he maneuvered my car into the barn, I took in my surroundings. The place looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Rusted farm equipment littered the overgrown yard, and a broken-down tractor sat half-covered by a tarp. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with tools and car parts. In the center sat an old muscle car, up on blocks with its hood open. "Quite the collection you've got here," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Earl beamed. "Been collecting for years. You'd be amazed what people throw away. One man's trash, right?" He gestured to a workbench. "Have a seat while I dig out that alternator." I perched on the edge of the bench, watching as Earl rummaged through boxes and drawers. My unease was growing by the minute. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "So," I said, desperate to break the silence, "you've lived out here long?" Earl paused in his search, a strange look crossing his face. "Oh, ages," he said vaguely. "Lost track of the years, to be honest." He turned back to me, holding up a part triumphantly. "Found it. This should do the trick." As he bent over my car's engine, I pulled out my phone again. Still no signal. I was completely cut off out here. "You know," Earl said, his voice muffled as he worked, "it's not often I get visitors out this way, especially not pretty young things like yourself." A chill ran down my spine. "Oh," I managed to say. "I would have thought lots of people have car trouble out here." Earl straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. There was an odd glint in his eye that hadn't been there before. "Oh, they do," he said softly. "They most certainly do." That's when I noticed it. Hanging on the wall behind Earl, partially obscured by shadow, was a collection of license plates. Dozens of them, from all different states. And they all looked recent. My heart began to race. I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know what? I think I'll just call for a tow. Thanks for your help, but I don't want to impose any further. Earl's face darkened. Now, he said, taking a step towards me. Don't be hasty. We're not finished here. I backed away, looking frantically for an escape route. But Earl was between me and the barn doors. And even if I could get past him, my car was useless. What do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. Earl's face split into that gold-toothed grin again, but there was no warmth in it now. Just some company, he said. It gets lonely out here, you know. And you'll do nicely. I ran, deeper into the barn, past the old muscle car, looking for another way out. I could hear Earl behind me, his footsteps unnervingly calm. No use running, girl, he called out. Ain't nowhere to go out here. I spotted a ladder leading up to a hayloft and scrambled up it, my hands slipping on the warm wood. As I pulled myself up, I knocked the ladder down, buying myself a few precious seconds. The hayloft was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, and there, in the far wall, was a small window. Moonlight streamed through it, illuminating my potential escape route. I sprinted for the window, hearing Earl cursing below as he tried to find another way up. The window was small, but I was pretty sure I could squeeze through. As I pushed it open, the rusty hinges protesting loudly, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The cocking of a shotgun. Now, don't do anything stupid, Earl's voice floated up from below. Come on down, and we can talk about this like civilized folks. I hesitated for a split second. Then I heard the barn doors slam shut and the sound of a heavy lock sliding into place. It was now or never. I took a deep breath and launched myself out the window. For a moment, I was falling through empty air. Then I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ankle. But there was no time to dwell on it. I scrambled to my feet and ran, ignoring the throbbing in my ankle. Behind me, I heard the boom of the shotgun and felt something whiz past my ear. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning and heart pounding. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that barn, away from Earl. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually, I saw lights in the distance. A gas station, its fluorescent lights, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I burst through the doors, startling the sleepy attendant. Call the police, I gasped. Please. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and paramedics checking me over. They found Earl's farm, but he was long gone. The barn was full of evidence. Personal belongings from who knows how many victims. They told me I was lucky to have escaped. But as I sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over my shoulders, I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, empty, like a part of me had been left behind in that barn. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I would never see highways the same way again. Every lonely stretch of road, every kindly stranger offering help, they would always make me think of Earl and the nightmare that could have been. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a promise to myself. I would never be that vulnerable again. Never be an easy target. Because out there, in the vast emptiness of the open road, there are monsters wearing human faces. And sometimes, the real horror isn't in what happens to you, but in what almost happened. In the knowledge that the darkness is always there, just waiting for an opportunity. I may have escaped Earl's barn, but a part of me will always be running down that dirt road, heart pounding, praying for salvation. And I know now that the true terror isn't in the moment of danger, but in the aftermath. In the knowledge that the world is not as safe as we pretend it is, and that sometimes the monsters win. But not this time. This time, I got away. And that, I suppose, will have to be enough. Story 5. I never thought a welcome mat could fill me with such dread. But there it was, sitting innocently on my new neighbor's porch, while every instinct screamed at me to run. If only I'd listened to that little voice. Maybe then I wouldn't be sitting here, blinds drawn, jumping at every sound, wondering if he's watching me right now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the day the house next door finally sold. I'd lived on Maple Street for 5 years, a quiet cul-de-sac where nothing much ever happened. The kind of place where you know everyone's name and business. So when a moving truck pulled up next door on a crisp autumn morning, it was the most excitement we'd had in months. I was out front, raking leaves, when I first saw him. A tall, lean man with sultan pepper hair, unloading boxes from the back of a sedan. He caught me looking and waved, a friendly smile on his face. "Hi there," he called out. "I'm David. Guess we're going to be neighbors." I walked over, leaves crunching under my feet, and introduced myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, almost too tight, and I noticed a strange scar running across his palm. "Thanks," David said, his blue eyes twinkling. "I have a good feeling about this place. Very peaceful." Single quote, something in the way he said peaceful sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was just being silly. David seemed nice enough, if a little intense. Over the next few weeks, David quickly became a fixture in the neighborhood. He was always out in his yard, trimming hedges or washing his car. He'd wave to everyone who passed by, flashing that same friendly smile. But there was something off about him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but little things started to nag at me. Like how I'd sometimes catch him staring at my house when he thought no one was looking. Or the way he'd ask very specific questions about my routine. When I left for work, what time I usually got home. "Just trying to get to know my neighbors," he'd say with a laugh when I commented on it. But the laugh never quite reached his eyes. Then there were the noises. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But late at night, I'd hear odd sounds coming from his house. Thumps and scrapes, like furniture being moved. And once, I could have sworn I heard muffled crying. I mentioned it to my best friend, Jen, over coffee one morning. "Maybe he's just a night owl," she suggested. "Or he could be renovating. You know how those old houses are." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "I guess," I said, stirring my latte absently. "But don't you think it's weird how he's always watching the street? Like he's waiting for something?" Jen rolled her eyes. "Honey, I think you've been watching too many true crime shows. He's probably just a lonely guy trying to make friends." I tried to take Jen's advice to heart. Maybe I was being paranoid. After all, David hadn't actually done anything wrong. He was just intense. But then came the night that changed everything. It was around 2 a.m. when a noise jerked me awake. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there it was again. A soft scraping sound coming from downstairs. My heart pounding, I crept out of bed and down the stairs, clutching my phone like a lifeline. As I reached the bottom, I froze. The scraping was coming from the back door. Peering through the curtains, I saw a figure hunched over the lock. The porch light caught a glint of silver, a lockpick. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "There's someone trying to break into my house," I whispered to the dispatcher. Just then, the figure straightened up and turned. The light fell on his face, and my blood ran cold. It was David. Our eyes met through the window. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then David's face split into that familiar smile, utterly incongruous with the situation. He raised his hand in a cheerful wave, as if we'd just bumped into each other at the grocery store. Then he turned and walked calmly back to his house, whistling softly. The police arrived 10 minutes later, but of course, there was no sign of David. They took my statement, but I could tell they were skeptical. No forced entry, no evidence left behind. Just the word of a hysterical woman who'd probably had a bad dream. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face, that eerie smile as he waved at me. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I installed new locks, a security system, but it didn't help. I could feel David's eyes on me constantly, watching from behind his curtains. When I left for work, his car would pull out just after mine. When I came home, he'd be out front, watering his lawn or checking his mail. Always with that same friendly wave and smile. "Evening, neighbor," he'd call out, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't caught him trying to break into my house. I tried talking to other neighbors, but no one believed me. "David, he's such a nice man," Mrs. Gillen's son, from across the street said, "always offering to help with my groceries. You must have been mistaken, dear." But I knew what I'd seen. And the more I watched David, the more I noticed things that didn't add up. Like how his trash cans were always empty on collection day, or how I never saw any lights on in his house at night, even though I could hear movement inside. One afternoon, I was in my backyard when I noticed something strange. A patch of disturbed earth in David's garden, right along the fence line. It hadn't been there the day before. As I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, David's back door opened. He stepped out, a shovel in his hand. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he called out, that now familiar smile on his face. But his eyes were cold, calculating. I mumbled something in response and hurried inside, my heart racing. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of digging coming from next door. The next morning, the disturbed patch of earth was gone, replaced by a neat row of new plants. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I waited until David left for his daily errands, then I snuck into his backyard. The new plants looked innocuous enough, but as I got closer, I noticed something poking out of the soil. I brushed away some dirt, and my blood ran cold. It was a finger, a human finger, partially decomposed. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. All the pieces were falling into place. The empty trash cans, the nighttime noises, the disturbed earth. I ran back to my house, slamming and locking the door behind me. With shaking hands, I called the police again. This time, they took me seriously. They came with a warrant, dogs, the whole 9 yards. I watched from my window as they dug up David's garden. One body, then another, and another. David came home in the middle of it all. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw the police cars. For just a second, the mask slipped. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by something cold and alien. Then, quick as a flash, the smile was back. "Officers," he said calmly, as if he was greeting old friends. "Is there a problem?" They arrested him on the spot. The story was all over the news for weeks. "Suburban serial killer," the headline screamed. 5 bodies found in his yard. More in the basement. But here's the thing. Even as they led him away in handcuffs, David kept smiling. And as the police car drove past my house, he turned and looked right at me. He winked. That was 6 months ago. David's in prison now, awaiting trial. The house next door stands empty, a constant reminder of the horror that lived there. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that soft whistle drifting on the wind. And in my darkest moments, I wonder, what if he had friends? What if I wasn't the only one watching my neighbors, looking for signs of something wrong? So I sit here, blinds drawn, jumping at every sound. Because now I know the truth. The real monsters don't hide under your bed or in your closet. They live next door. They smile and wave and offer to help with your groceries. And they're always watching. Story 6. The first cairn should have been our warning. A simple stack of rocks, innocent enough to the untrained eye. But as we ventured deeper into the forgotten trail, those piles of stone began to tell a story. A story that, looking back, we should have never tried to read. My name's Mike, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my adult life. There's something about losing yourself in nature, pushing your limits against the backdrop of untamed wilderness, that's always called to me. So when my buddy Chris suggested we try out an unmarked trail he'd heard about from some locals, I was all in. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and the world seems sharp and new. The main trail was busy with weekend warriors, families out for a stroll, the usual crowd. But as we veered off onto our secret path, the chatter and laughter faded away, replaced by the soft crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. "Man, this is more like it," Chris said, grinning as he adjusted his pack. "No selfie stick tourists out here." I nodded, breathing in the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. "Yeah, it's perfect. How'd you hear about this place again?" Chris's smile faltered for just a second. "Oh, you know, guy at the gear shop mentioned it. Said it was a local secret, great views." Something in his tone made me glance over, but he was already moving ahead, pushing through a tangle of undergrowth. I shrugged it off and followed. The trail, if you could call it that, was barely visible. Just a slightly clearer path through the dense forest, marked occasionally by those cairns. At first, they were simple. 3 or 4 rocks balanced on top of each other. But as we pressed deeper into the woods, they began to change. The first really odd one appeared about an hour into our hike. It was larger than the others, with jagged rocks arranged in a way that almost looked like a twisted face. I paused, studying it. "Hey Chris, check this out," I called. "Kinda creepy, huh?" Chris came back, his face oddly pale in the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Creepy," I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "What, you scared of a pile of rocks?" He forced a smile. "Nah, man. Just, let's keep moving, alright? We've got a lot of ground to cover." As we hiked on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sky. The air felt heavier, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic. The cairns became more frequent and more elaborate. Some towered over us, precarious stacks that looked like they should topple in the slightest breeze. Others were arranged in intricate patterns on the ground, spirals and concentric circles that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. "Chris," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness, "I'm starting to think this isn't a normal trail." He didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "We should keep going. It'll be fine." But it wasn't fine. With each step, the sense of wrongness grew. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of our breathing and the thud of our heartbeats. Then we found the clearing. It was a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across. The trees around it were bent inward, their trunks twisted at unnatural angles, as if straining to touch the center. And in that center stood the largest cairn yet. It was easily 10 feet tall, a jumble of rocks that somehow formed a coherent shape. As we approached, my stomach lurched. It looked like a human figure, arms outstretched, head tilted back in a silent scream. "What the hell?" I whispered. "Chris, we need to get out of here." But Chris wasn't listening. He was staring at the cairn, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Can't you hear it?" he murmured. "The whispers. They're calling us." I grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Snap out of it, man. There's nothing whispering. We need to go, now." He blinked, seeming to come back to himself. Yeah, you're right." Let's a crack echoed through the clearing, like a gunshot. We both jumped, spinning around. One of the rocks in the cairn had split clean in two. "Run," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Run." We took off, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots seemed to reach up to trip us. Behind us, I could hear a sound like grinding stone, growing louder. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The cairn was moving, rocks grinding against each other as it reshaped itself. As I watched, horrified, a crude arm extended, reaching for us. "Don't look back," I screamed to Chris. "Just run." We ran until our lungs burned, until my legs felt like jelly. The sounds behind us faded, replaced by our ragged breathing and pounding hearts. Finally, we burst out onto the main trail. A family out for a hike stared at us in alarm, taking in our wild eyes and scratched up faces. "Are you boys all right?" the father asked, concern etched on his face. I opened my mouth to answer, to warn them about what we'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the impossible? "We're fine," Chris said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Just took a wrong turn. Got a little lost." The father nodded sympathetically. "It happens. Stick to the marked trails next time." "Yeah." We mumbled our thanks and hurried on, not stopping until we reached the parking lot. As we collapsed against Chris's car, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving me shaky and nauseous. What the hell was that?" I gasped. Chris shook his head, his face ashen. "I don't know, man. I don't know." We drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were nearly back to town that Chris spoke again. "Mike," he said, his voice barely audible, "I need to tell you something." I turned to look at him, dread pooling in my stomach. "What?" He swallowed hard. "That trail. I didn't hear about it from some guy at the gear shop. I found it online, on this forum for extreme hikers. They said it was a test. That if you could make it through, you'd see things no one else had ever seen." I stared at him, anger and disbelief warring inside me. "Are you kidding me? You dragged us out there on some internet dare." "I'm sorry," he whispered. I didn't believe it would be like that. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him how stupid and reckless he'd been. But the haunted look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever Chris had experienced out there, it had shaken him to his core. We didn't talk about it after that day. Tried to pretend it had never happened. But the nightmares came anyway. Dreams of stone figures chasing me through endless forests, of whispers just on the edge of hearing, promising terrible secrets. Months passed. Life went on. but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something we were never meant to see. That by walking that forgotten trail, we'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. Then, last week, I got a text from Chris. Just 2 words. They're coming. I tried calling him back, but his phone was disconnected. Went by his apartment, but he was gone. No note, no explanation. Just an empty room and a crudely built cairn on his bedside table. So now I sit here, writing this down. A warning, I suppose, to anyone who might be tempted by stories of secret trails and hidden wonders. Some paths are meant to stay forgotten. Some stones are better left unturned. Because out there in the deep woods, where the trees grow thick and the shadows run deep, there are things waiting. Ancient things, patient things. And once you've caught their attention, there's no going back. If you're reading this, please stick to the marked trails. Don't go looking for secrets in the wilderness, because sometimes the wilderness looks back, and what it sees in you might just be enough to make it hungry. As for me, I'm going back out there to find Chris, if I can, or to face whatever's waiting in those twisted woods, because I know now that it wasn't chance that led us there that day. We were called, chosen, and sooner or later, we all have to answer when the stones start to whisper our names. Story 7. The first night, I dismissed the footsteps as my imagination. By the third night, I knew I wasn't alone in that empty building. But let me start at the beginning, back when a graveyard shift as a security guard seemed like easy money. My name's Tom, and I'd just moved to the city, desperate for any job to pay the rent. When I saw the ad for overnight security at Oakwood Office Plaza, it seemed perfect. Easy work, they said. Just walk the rounds and make sure everything's locked up tight. Yeah, right. If only they'd told me what else I'd be locking in with me. My first night started normally enough. The day shift guy, a beefy dude named Frank, gave me a quick tour. Oakwood Plaza was this massive, aging office complex. 15 floors of cubicles and conference rooms, most of them empty now. The kind of place that had seen better days. Economic downturn hit this place hard, Frank explained as we rode the creaky elevator. Used to be bustling, now it's a ghost town. Just a handful of small businesses left, mostly on the lower floors. I nodded, trying to look interested while fighting back a yawn. It was barely 10 p.m., and I was already dragging. This was going to be a long night. Frank handed me a ring of keys that weighed about 10 pounds. Main thing is to do your rounds every couple hours. Check all the doors. Make sure no one's where they shouldn't be. Oh, and don't go in the basement. Old boiler room down there. Not safe. I raised an eyebrow. Not safe? How? He shrugged. Asbestos or something. Above my pay grade. Just don't go down there, alright? With that ominous warning, Frank headed out, leaving me alone in the cavernous lobby. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows in the corners. I settled into the security desk, propping my feet up and pulling out my phone. This was gonna be cake. The first few hours crawled by. I did my initial round, footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Everything was locked up tight, just like Frank said. By 2 a.m., I was fighting to keep my eyes open. That's when I heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy being set down, coming from a few floors up. I sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. It was probably nothing. Old buildings make noise all the time, right? But I figured I should check it out. That's what they were paying me for, after all. I took the stairs, not trusting that ancient elevator. As I climbed, the sound came again, definitely from the 7th floor. My heart was pounding as I pushed open the stairwell door. The 7th floor was pitch black. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Rows of cubicles stood silent, the beam reflecting off computer screens and family photos left behind. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast space. "Anyone here?" No answer. Just the soft hum of the emergency lights. I did a sweep at the floor, checking every corner and closet. Nothing out of place. Must have been the building settling, I told myself. Just my nerves getting the better of me. As I headed back to the stairs, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I whirled around, heart in my throat. But it was just my reflection in a window, distorted by the curvature of the glass. I let out a shaky laugh. "Get it together, Tom," I muttered. "It's just an empty building." The rest of the night passed uneventfully. When Frank showed up to relieve me, I didn't mention the noise. No need to look like a jumpy rookie on my first night. The second night started much like the first. I settled in with a book, determined to stay awake this time. Around midnight, I did my first round. Everything normal, everything quiet. It was during my 2 a.m. round that things got weird. I was on the 10th floor when I noticed something odd. A desk lamp was on in one of the cubicles. I frowned, sure it had been off earlier. As I approached, I heard a soft click, and the lamp winked out. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I rushed to the cubicle, flashlight beam dancing wildly. But there was no one there. Just an empty chair and a desk covered in a thin layer of dust. I reached out to touch the lamp. The bulb was cold. A chill ran down my spine. I did another sweep of the floor, but found nothing. As I rode the elevator back down, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I spent the rest of the night at the security desk, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. The third night, I came prepared. Extra flashlights, a thermos of coffee, even some salt hay. It couldn't hurt, right? I was determined to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. Everything was quiet until about 3 a.m. I was midway through my rounds when I heard it. Footsteps, clear as day, coming from the floor above me. Not the shuffling of a vagrant or the skittering of a rat. These were purposeful strides, like someone in a hurry. My heart was pounding as I raced up the stairs. I burst onto the 12th floor, flashlight at the ready. "Who's there?" I shouted. "This is security. Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a laugh. Low and mirthless, it sent ice through my veins. I swept my flashlight around wildly, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the shadows. The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. I chased after them, but it was like trying to catch smoke. Every time I thought I was getting close, the sound would shift, coming from behind me or above me. Finally, exhausted and terrified, I slumped against a wall. That's when I noticed where I was. Right in front of the elevator to the basement. The place Frank had warned me about. As I stared at those closed doors, a thought nagged at me. What if whatever I'd been chasing had gone down there? I knew I shouldn't. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to turn around, to run. But I had to know. With shaking hands, I pressed the call button. The elevator groaned to life, ancient gears grinding. When the doors opened, stale air washed over me. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the gloom. The ride down felt like it took hours. When the doors finally opened, I was hit by a wave of cold, damp air. The basement was a maze of pipes and old machinery, rust and decay everywhere. I took a few tentative steps, my flashlight beam dancing over crumbling concrete walls. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. "Hey, Shiloh," I managed to croak out. The figure didn't move. As I edged closer, heart pounding, I realized why. It wasn't a person at all, but a mannequin. An old, cracked display dummy propped up against the wall. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. Just an old piece of junk, nothing to be afraid of. I turned to head back to the elevator and found myself face to face with Frank. I yelped, stumbling backward. "Jesus, Frank, you scared the hell out of me. What are you doing down here?" But something was wrong. Frank's eyes were glassy, unfocused, and his skin, in the harsh beam of my flashlight, it looked waxy, artificial. "Frank," I whispered. He smiled then, a terrible rictus grin that split his face. "Not Frank," he said, in a voice like grinding stones. "Not anymore." I ran, blind panic propelling me through the maze of the basement. Behind me, I could hear something giving chase. The slap of feet on concrete, a rasping laugh that didn't sound human. I found the stairs and took them two at a time, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I burst out of the building into the cool night air. I ran all the way to my car, peeling out of the parking lot with tires squealing. I never went back to Oakwood Plaza. Called in sick the next day, then quit. Told them to mail my check. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that building again. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the sound of those footsteps echoing in my dreams. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Stress, lack of sleep, an overactive imagination. But sometimes, when I'm walking down a crowded street, I'll catch a glimpse of a familiar face. A man who looks just like Frank, watching me with those glassy eyes. And I'll remember the chill of the basement, the inhuman grin, the voice that wasn't Frank's. "Not anymore," it had said. And I'll wonder, what else is out there, wearing the faces of people we think we know? What walks the empty halls of old buildings when the lights go out? And how thin is the line between our world and whatever lies beyond? I don't work night shifts anymore, and I always leave the lights on. Story 8. I never thought a friend request could be the beginning of a nightmare. But as I sit here, curtains drawn, jumping at every notification, I realize how wrong I was. The internet isn't just a tool anymore. It's a portal. And sometimes, what comes through is far worse than any virus or scam. It all started on a rainy Tuesday evening. I'm Sarah, by the way, 32, single, and working a soul-crushing job in data entry. My social life consisted mostly of Netflix binges and the occasional chat with online friends. So when I got a friend request from a user named Alex_87, I didn't think twice about accepting. Alex seemed nice enough at first. We bonded over our shared love of obscure 80s movies and passion for true crime podcasts. It was refreshing to talk to someone who got my weird sense of humor. We'd chat for hours, losing track of time as we delved into increasingly personal conversations. "It's weird," I typed one night, around 2 a.m. "I feel like I've known you forever." "Maybe you have," came the reply. "In another life, perhaps." I laughed it off, but something about that message sent a shiver down my spine. I brushed it aside, blaming it on too much coffee and late-night jitters. As the weeks went by, I found myself sharing more and more with Alex. My hopes, my fears, childhood memories I'd never told anyone else. It was like Alex knew exactly what to say to make me open up. But then things started to get odd. It began with little things. Alex would mention details about my life I was sure I hadn't shared. The name of my first pet, the street I grew up on. At first I chalked it up to a good memory or lucky guesses. Then came the dreams. Vivid nightmares where I was being watched, followed by a shadowy figure I could never quite see. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and every time, without fail, there'd be a message from Alex waiting for me. "Bad dream," the message would say. "Want to talk about it?" How did they know? I never mentioned my nightmares in our chats. The uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach grew. One night, after a particularly terrifying dream, I decided to confront Alex. "How do you always know when I've had a nightmare?" I typed, fingers shaking slightly. There was a long pause before the reply came. "I just know you, Sarah, better than you know yourself." The chill that ran through me at those words was like ice water in my veins. I slammed my laptop shut, suddenly feeling exposed in my own bedroom. The next day at work, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced up from my computer, I expected to see someone staring at me. But it was just the usual sea of cubicles, my co-workers absorbed in their own mundane tasks. As I was leaving for the day, my boss stopped me. "Hey Sarah, got a sec?" I nodded, following him to his office with a sense of dread. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "You've seemed distracted lately, and there have been some inconsistencies in your work." I swallowed hard. "I'm fine, just haven't been sleeping well. I'll do better, I promise." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. As I turned to leave, he called out, "Oh, and Sarah, a friend of yours dropped this off for you earlier." He handed me a small package. My blood ran cold as I read the label. "To Sarah, from Alex." I muttered a thanks and practically ran out of the office, clutching the package like it might explode. Once in my car, I tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a small, antique-looking mirror. As I lifted it out, a note fluttered to the floor. "To see yourself as I see you," it read in an elegant script. I looked into the mirror, half expecting to see some horrific visage. But it was just my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed with fear. That night, I didn't turn on my computer. I unplugged my router, turned off my phone. I needed to think, to process what was happening without the constant pressure of Alex's presence. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind raced. How much did Alex really know about me? How had they found out where I worked? And that mirror, where had it come from? Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with disjointed images. I dreamed of dark corridors, of doors that opened onto more doors, and always, just at the edge of my vision, a figure watching, waiting. I woke with a start, heart pounding. The room was pitch black, but I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. I reached for the bedside lamp, fumbling in the darkness. As light flooded the room, I screamed. There, propped up on my dresser, was the mirror from Alex. But my reflection, it wasn't me. The face staring back was twisted, eyes too large, mouth stretched in an impossible grin. As I watched, horrified, it winked at me. I threw the mirror across the room, hearing it shatter against the wall. Panting, I scrambled out of bed, flicking on every light in my apartment. My phone buzzed. With shaking hands, I picked it up. One new message from Alex. "Why did you break it, Sarah? Don't you want to see the real you?" I dropped the phone like it had burned me. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank or a mental breakdown. Maybe I was still dreaming, but deep down, I knew this was real, and it was far from over. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I called in sick to work, ignoring my boss's concerned voicemails. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving my apartment, of facing a world where Alex might be lurking around any corner. I tried to research Alex online to find any trace of who they really were, but it was like they didn't exist outside of our conversations. No social media profiles, no digital footprint, just an avatar and a string of messages that now seemed loaded with hidden meanings. On the third day of my self-imposed isolation, there was a knock at my door. I froze, heart racing. Had Alex finally come in person? "Sarah, it's Jen. Are you okay? You haven't been answering my calls." I let out a shaky breath. Just my best friend, worried about me. I opened the door, blinking in the harsh hallway light. Jen's eyes widened as she took in my disheveled appearance. "Jesus, Sarah. What happened to you?" I broke down then, sobbing as I told her everything. The online friend, the strange coincidences, the mirror. To her credit, Jen listened without interrupting, her face growing more concerned with each word. When I finished, she pulled me into a hug. "Oh, honey, why didn't you tell me sooner? We need to go to the police." I shook my head violently. No police. They'll think I'm crazy." "Hell, maybe I am crazy." Jen's voice was firm. "You're not crazy. Something seriously weird is going on, and we're going to figure it out together." Her confidence was reassuring. But as she helped me pack an overnight bag to stay at her place, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, curled up on Jen's couch, I finally slept without nightmares. But when I woke in the morning, Jen was gone. A note on the coffee table said she'd run out for groceries. I stretched, feeling more like myself than I had in days. Maybe all I'd needed was a friendly face and a change of scenery. My phone buzzed. A text from Jen. "Check your email. Important." Curious, I opened my laptop. There, at the top of my inbox, was a message from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line made my blood run cold. "Did you really think you could escape me, Sarah?" With trembling fingers, I clicked it open. Inside was a single line of text. "Look behind you." I whirled around, heart pounding. And there, reflected in Jen's TV screen, was Alex, but not the avatar I'd known. This face was familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. It smiled, and with a jolt of horror, I realized why. It was my own face, but wrong, twisted. The same impossible grin I'd seen in the mirror. "Welcome home, Sarah," it said, in a voice that was mine, but not mine. "We have so much to catch up on." The screen went black, reflecting only my own terrified face, but I could still hear that voice echoing in my head. "After all," it whispered, "I'm you. I've always been you. And now it's time for us to become one." I ran. Out of Jen's apartment, down the stairs, into the street. But with every reflective surface I passed, car, windows, storefronts, puddles on the ground, I saw that twisted version of myself, watching, waiting, grinning, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that there was no escape. Because how do you run from something that's inside you? So now I sit here, in a cheap motel room with the mirrors covered and the curtains drawn, writing this down as a warning. Be careful who you let into your life online, because sometimes the person on the other end of that friend request isn't just a stranger. Sometimes they're the darkest part of yourself, waiting to be set free. And once they're out, there's no going back. Story 9. I never thought a shortcut could lead me so far astray. But as I sit here, engine idling, staring at a road sign I've passed 3 times already. I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever find my way home, or if home even exists anymore. It all started on a Tuesday, just another mind-numbing commute in a long string of them. I'm Dave, by the way, 35, married, 2 kids, and a soul-crushing job in middle management that has me on the road more often than I'd like. That particular morning, I was running late for a meeting in the city. Traffic on the highway was at a standstill, brake lights stretching as far as the eye could see. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, watching the minutes tick by on the dashboard clock. That's when I remembered something a co-worker had mentioned a few days back, a secret route that bypassed the worst of the traffic. I'd brushed it off at the time. I'm not usually one for breaking routine, but desperate times, right. I pulled up the navigation app on my phone, inputting the directions my coworker had scribbled down. The app hesitated for a moment, as if unsure, before plotting a route that veered off the highway onto a network of back roads I'd never noticed before. Here goes nothing, I muttered, flicking on my turn signal and cutting across 2 lanes to make the exit. The change was almost immediate. The cacophony of horns and engines faded away, replaced by the gentle swish of tires on asphalt. The road narrowed, winding through dense forest that pressed in close on both sides. Shafts of early morning sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the road ahead. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. This was nice. Peaceful. Why hadn't I tried this route before? The first sign that something was off came about 15 minutes in. I passed a house that looked wrong, somehow. It was an old farmhouse, paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. But there was something about the proportions that didn't quite add up. The windows were too tall, the door too narrow. It was like looking at a child's drawing of a house brought to life. I shook my head, blaming it on lack of sleep and too much coffee. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that things around me were subtly shifting. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. The sky, which had been a clear blue when I started, was now an odd greenish-grey color, and the air inside the car felt thicker, harder to breathe. I glanced at my phone, but the screen was black. Dead battery. No, I'd just charged it this morning. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. The knot of unease in my stomach tightened. That's when I noticed the houses. They were becoming more frequent now, lining both sides of the road. But each one looked off, like that first farmhouse, but worse. Some had doors where windows should be. Others seemed to twist in on themselves, defying the laws of physics. And all of them looked abandoned, empty windows staring out like dead eyes. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "It's fine," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the confines of the car. "Just a weird neighborhood. Probably some kind of artistic community or something." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was something else. Something wrong. I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to get through this strange area and back to familiar territory. But no matter how fast I drove, the houses kept coming, and they were changing, evolving into something less and less like houses and more like. I didn't even have words for it. Structures that looked like they'd been built by someone who'd only heard houses described but never actually seen one. Twisted spires that spiraled up into the sickly sky. And always those empty windows, watching. I was starting to panic now, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to turn around, to get back to the highway. But every time I tried to make a U-turn, the road would twist, leading me deeper into this nightmare landscape. That's when I saw the gas station. It looked blessedly normal amidst the otherworldly structures around it. A faded sign proclaimed last, stop, gas and convenience. My fuel gauge was hovering near empty. How long had I been driving? So I pulled in, relief flooding through me. As I got out of the car, the silence hit me like a physical force. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just a oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on my eardrums. The bell above the door jangled as I entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. The interior was dim, illuminated only by flickering fluorescent lights. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stocked with products I didn't recognize. The labels were blurred, as if seen through water. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Anyone here?" No answer. I made my way to the counter, looking for an attendant. That's when I saw the newspaper rack. My blood ran cold as I read the headlines. Missing commuter count rises to 15. Mysterious shortcut. Claims and other victim authorities baffled by disappearances were shaking hands. I picked up one of the papers. The date at the top made no sense. It was 3 months in the future. And there, on the front page, was my own face. Local man vanishes on way to work. The caption read. I dropped the paper like it had burned me, backing away. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, or having some kind of mental breakdown. The bell above the door jangled again. I whirled around, heart pounding. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the sickly green light outside. It looked human, almost, but its proportions were all wrong, limbs too long and at odd angles. Its face, I couldn't focus on its face. Every time I tried, my vision would blur, like my mind was refusing to process what it was seeing. "Welcome, traveler," it said, in a voice that sounded like several people speaking at once. "We've been expecting you," I ran. Out the back door of the gas station, into my car. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. But as I drove, I realized with growing horror that nothing looked familiar anymore. The road kept changing, shifting under my wheels. Houses appeared and disappeared in my rearview mirror. And always, always, that sickly green sky overhead. I've been driving for, I don't know how long now. Hours, days. My watch has stopped. My phone is dead. The fuel gauge hovers perpetually near empty, but the car keeps running. Sometimes I see other vehicles on the road. They look normal at first, but as I get closer, I realize the drivers aren't right. Their faces are blurred or missing entirely. They wave as I pass, gestures too fluid to be natural. I've tried stopping, tried asking for directions, but every person I talk to gives me the same response. Just a little further. You're almost there. Almost where? I don't know anymore. The road stretches out before me, endless and ever-changing. Sometimes I think I see familiar landmarks. My kids' school, my office building, but they vanish as I approach, like mirages in a desert. I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever make it back, if there's even a back to get to anymore. Maybe this is my life now, driving endlessly through a world that doesn't make sense, chasing a destination I can't reach. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Stick to the main roads. Don't take shortcuts, no matter how tempting they might seem. Because sometimes, the quickest route between 2 points isn't a straight line. Sometimes, it's a twisted path that leads you far from home, into places you were never meant to see. And once you're on that path, there's no guarantee you'll ever find your way back. I see another gas station up ahead. Maybe this time, I'll find some answers. Or maybe I'll just find another version of myself, trapped in tomorrow's headlines. Either way, I have to keep driving. It's all I have left now. Just a little further. I'm almost there, aren't I? Story 10. The first time we got lost, we laughed it off. The fifth time, panic set in. Now, I'm not sure we'll ever find our way out of these woods. But let me start at the beginning, back when a day hike seemed like a great idea for a date. I'm Jess, and I've always been the outdoorsy type. So when I matched with Mike on a dating app and saw he was into hiking too, I figured why not suggest a trail I'd been wanting to check out. Cascade Falls was supposed to be beautiful this time of year, and the loop trail was only meant to take a few hours. We met at the trailhead early Saturday morning. Mike was cute in that rugged flannel shirt kind of way, with a ready smile that put me at ease immediately. Ready for adventure? I asked, shouldering my backpack. He grinned, adjusting his baseball cap. Lead the way, trail boss. The first hour was perfect. The air was crisp with the promise of fall, leaves just starting to turn golden at the edges. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor. We chatted easily as we walked, discovering shared interests and swapping stories. The trouble started when we reached the falls. They were stunning. A sheet of white water cascading down a rocky cliff face, mist filling the air. We stopped for lunch, perched on a boulder with our feet dangling over the crystal clear pool at the base of the falls. This is amazing, Mike said, taking a big bite of his sandwich. How'd you find this place? I shrugged, feeling a little proud. Did some research online. Crazy that it's not more well known, right? After lunch, we packed up and headed out, following the trail that would loop us back to the parking lot. That's when things started to get weird. About 20 minutes in, I frowned, looking around. The trees seemed denser here, the undergrowth thicker. This doesn't look familiar, I muttered. Mike glanced at me. Well, we're on the other side of the loop now, right? Bound to look different. I nodded, but something felt off. The quality of the light had changed, becoming dimmer, more diffuse, and the air felt heavier somehow, charged, like right before a thunderstorm. We pressed on. Another half hour passed, and my unease grew. We should have been seeing signs of the trailhead by now. Instead, the forest around us seemed wilder, more primeval. Jess, Mike said, his voice tight. I think we might be lost. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The map app showed our location as a blank green space, no trails marked. That's impossible, I said. We've been following the path the whole time. But as I looked down, I realized with a jolt that the well-worn trail we'd been on had faded away. We were standing in trackless forest, with no sign of which way we'd come. Okay, don't panic, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We just need to backtrack. The falls can't be that far. We turned around, trying to retrace our steps. But nothing looked familiar. The trees all blurred together, an endless sea of green and brown. The light continued to dim, though my watch said it was barely mid-afternoon. After what felt like hours of walking, we stumbled into a small clearing. My heart leaped. Maybe this was near the trailhead, but as we entered the space, that hope died. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, each about waist high. They looked ancient, covered in moss and strange, swirling symbols. The air here felt even thicker, almost syrupy, and there was a sound right at the edge of hearing, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What the hell? Mike whispered, his face pale. I shook my head, at a loss for words. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. We skirted the edge of the clearing, both of us instinctively avoiding the stone circle. As we re-entered the trees on the far side, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of something pale darting between the trunks. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" I asked Mike. He nodded, eyes wide. "Let's pick up the pace." "Yeah." We started moving faster, no longer even pretending to look for the trail, just pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to find some sign of civilization. The forest seemed to press in closer with each step. Branches reached out like grasping fingers, snagging our clothes. Roots appeared underfoot, threatening to trip us. And always, that feeling of being watched, of something moving just beyond our field of vision. Night fell with startling suddenness. One moment, we were in twilight gloom. The next, pitch darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness like a knife. "We need to stop," Mike panted. "We're just getting more lost." I nodded, trying to ignore the tremor in my hands as I set up our meager camp. We hadn't packed for an overnight trip, just some trail mix, water, and a light jacket each. As we huddled together for warmth, I tried to stay positive. "Someone will notice we're missing," I said. "They'll send out a search party." Mike nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with strange dreams. I saw the stone circle glowing with an inner light. Pale, elongated figures danced around it, their movements jerky and inhuman. And always, that pulsing hum, growing louder and louder until it filled my head. I woke with a start, heart pounding. The forest was silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just that omnipresent hum, now audible even when awake. "Mike," I whispered, shaking him awake. "We need to move." He blinked groggily, then sat up with a gasp. "Jess, the trees." I looked around and felt my blood run cold. The trees had moved. Where there had been open space the night before, there was now a wall of trunks, pressing in close. It was like the forest had grown around us while we slept. We packed up quickly, not speaking. There was only one direction, not blocked by trees, and we took it, pushing through the undergrowth with desperate speed. As we walked, I began to notice things. Strange things. Trees with bark that looked almost like faces, twisted in silent screams. Flowers and colors that didn't exist in nature, their petals following our movement. And always that feeling of being watched. We walked for hours, the forest growing stranger with each step. The ground became spongy underfoot, each step accompanied by a sickening squelch. The air took on a greenish tinge, thick with spores or pollen that made it hard to breathe. And then we saw it. Another clearing, larger than the first. And in its center, a structure that defied description. It was like a house, but all wrong. Doors where windows should be, stairs that led to nowhere, angles that hurt the eye to look at. "What is this place?" Mike whispered, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, I saw movement. From the twisted doorway of the impossible house, a figure emerged. It was humanoid, but too tall, too thin. Its skin was pale as milk, stretched tight over an angular frame. And its face. I couldn't look at its face. Every time I tried, my vision would blur, my mind refusing to process what it was seeing. "Welcome," it said, in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves and creaking wood. "We've been waiting for you," Mike screamed. The sound jolted me out of my paralysis, and we ran. Crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear something pursuing. Not footsteps, but a sound like trees groaning in a high wind. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs felt like lead, and then we ran some more. Finally, gasping and stumbling, we broke through a line of trees and found ourselves right back at the first stone circle. "No," I moaned, falling to my knees. "This isn't possible." Mike helped me up, his face a mask of terror. "We have to keep moving," he said. "They're coming." But as we turned to run again, we found our path blocked. Pale, twisted figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their elongated limbs swaying gently despite the lack of wind. And from the trees all around us came that voice again, no longer just one, but a chorus, surrounding us. "You cannot leave," they said in unison. "The forest has chosen you. You are home now." I felt something inside me break. Home. Yes, this was home now. Had always been home. I turned to Mike, seeing the same realization dawning in his eyes. We reached for each other, our fingers elongating, skin growing pale. And we stepped into the circle, joining the dance that had been waiting for us since the beginning of time. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Stick to the marked trails. Don't venture into unknown woods, because sometimes the forest is more than just trees and underbrush. Sometimes it's alive, aware, hungry, and once it chooses you, there's no going back. You become part of it, forever walking paths that lead nowhere and everywhere. Just another lost soul in an endless, twisted wood. But don't worry. If you wander far enough, if you take that one wrong turn, we'll be waiting to welcome you home. Story 11. The first tremor was so slight, I almost missed it. A gentle vibration beneath my feet, like a subway passing far below. But there are no subways on Mount Erebus. And as I stood there, ice axe in hand, staring at the impossibly twisted rock formations around me, I realized with growing horror that the mountain was awake, and it was hungry. My name's Alex, and I've been a climber all my life. Everest, Kadua, Annapurna, I'd conquered them all. But Erebus was different. The southernmost active volcano on Earth, located in Antarctica, it had always been my white whale, the ultimate challenge. When I finally got the chance to join an expedition, I jumped at it. Our team was small. Just me, our guide, Mike, and 2 other experienced climbers, Sarah and Tom. We were all seasoned pros, used to the dangers of extreme alpinism, or so we thought. The first few days of the climb were tough but exhilarating. The icy wind bit at any exposed skin, and the terrain was treacherous, but the views were breathtaking. Endless fields of snow and ice, stretching out to the horizon, broken only by the jagged peaks of the Transantarctic Mountains in the distance. It was on the 4th day that things started to get weird. We'd made camp in a small plateau, sheltered by a towering wall of black volcanic rock. As I was setting up my tent, I noticed something odd about the rock face. There were patterns in it, swirling designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Hey Mike," I called out, "come check this out." Our guide ambled over, his beard crusted with ice. He squinted at the rock face, then shrugged. "Just natural formations. Alex, lava does weird things when it cools." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. That night, as the wind howled outside our tents, I dreamed of those patterns. In my dream, they moved and pulsed, forming shapes that hurt my brain to look at. I woke with a start, heart pounding. The tent was silent, except for Tom's soft snoring from the other side. But there was something else. A low, barely audible hum, coming from somewhere deep below us. The next morning, as we packed up camp, I mentioned the sound to Sarah. She cocked her head, listening. "I don't hear anything," she said. "Probably just the wind playing tricks on you." I nodded, but I couldn't shake my unease. As we started our ascent, I noticed more of those strange rock formations. They seemed to be everywhere now, twisting up from the snow in impossible shapes. And always that faint hum, just at the edge of hearing. It was mid-afternoon when we felt the first tremor. We all stopped, exchanging nervous glances. "That's normal, right?" Tom asked, a slight quaver in his voice. "I mean, it is an active volcano." Mike frowned, consulting his instruments. "It's showing some unusual activity, but nothing too concerning. We'll keep an eye on it." We pressed on, but the tremors continued, growing stronger. The hum was getting louder too, no longer just in my head. I could see the others reacting to it now, wincing and shaking their heads as if trying to clear them. As we climbed higher, the air grew thicker, filled with a sulphurous stench that made my eyes water. The snow beneath our feet was patchy, revealing more of that strange, twisted rock. And the shapes had formed. They were no longer random. I could swear I saw faces in the stone, mouths open in silent screams. "Guys," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Is it just me, or is the mountain moving?" I looked up and felt my stomach lurch. The peak above us seemed to be shifting, changing shape before our eyes. It was subtle at first, like heat shimmer on a hot day. But as I watched, horrified, I saw a massive section of rock fold in on itself, reforming into something that looked disturbingly like a giant, lidless eye. "We need to get off this mountain," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But as we turned to head back down, we found our path blocked. Where there had been a clear route just moments before, there was now a sheer cliff face. The rock twisted into those same horrifying patterns. The tremors were almost constant now, the whole mountain shaking beneath our feet. Cracks appeared in the ice, venting steam and that noxious sulfur smell. And through it all, that maddening hum grew louder and louder, filling my head until I could barely think. "There!" Tom shouted, pointing. Through the swirling mist, I could just make out a dark opening in the rock face. A cave. We made a run for it, stumbling over the quaking ground. Just as we reached the entrance, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. A deep, resonant groan, like continental plates shifting. But underlying it was something else. Something almost like a voice. We huddled in the cave, watching in horror as the world outside transformed. The very shape of the mountain was changing, rock flowing like water, forming and reforming into nightmarish configurations. And everywhere, those patterns, now glowing with an inner light that hurt to look at. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her face pale in the eerie light. Mike shook his head, eyes wide with terror. "This is impossible. Mountains don't just move like this." But it was. And as I watched, a terrible realization dawned on me. The mountain wasn't just moving. It was waking up. That's when I saw them. Figures moving through the chaos outside. At first, I thought they were other climbers. But as they got closer, I realized with growing horror that they weren't human. Not even close. They were tall, impossibly tall, with bodies that seemed to be made of that same twisted rock. Their movements were fluid, bonus, defying the laws of physics. And their faces. I couldn't look at their faces. Every time I tried, my vision would blur, my mind recoiling from what it was seeing. One of them approached the cave entrance. As it neared, that omnipresent hum grew to a deafening roar. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, resonating through my very bones. The creature spoke, not with words, but with impressions that burned themselves into my brain. Images of vast, cyclopean cities buried beneath the ice, of creatures that slumbered for eons, waiting for the stars to align, of a hunger so profound, so all-encompassing, that it could swallow the world. I screamed. We all did. The sheer alienness of it, the wrongness, was too much for our minds to bear. When I came to, I was alone in the cave. There was no sign of the others, no equipment, nothing to suggest anyone had ever been there but me. Outside, the mountain was still. The strange rock formations were gone, replaced by normal, if rugged, terrain. I made my way down in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. When I finally reached the research station at the base, I babbled out my story. They listened politely, then gently suggested I might be suffering from altitude sickness or hypothermia. No one believed me. There was no record of any unusual seismic activity. No other climbers reported seeing anything strange. My teammates, according to the station logs, I'd come alone. There was no Mike, no Sarah, no Tom. That was 3 months ago. I'm back home now, trying to piece my life back together, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that hum again, and in my dreams, I see those twisted rock formations slowly spreading across the world. I know now that Erebus isn't just a mountain. It's something ancient, something alive, and it's awake now, thanks to us. So, if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Stay away from Mount Erebus. Stay away from Antarctica, because sometimes the greatest horrors aren't what we bring with us to the unknown. They're what's waiting for us there, patient and hungry, since before the dawn of time. And once they notice us, once they're awake, there's no going back to sleep. Story 12. The first night I heard the whispers, I dismissed them as the wind. By the third night, I knew the trees were trying to tell me something. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. My name's Liam, and I'd always been a city boy. But when my uncle passed away and left me his cabin in the woods, I figured a change of scenery might do me good. Writer's block had been kicking my ass for months, and I hoped the solitude would spark my creativity. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect. Rustic, a little run down, but charming in its own way. Nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, it felt like stepping into another world. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. As I unloaded my car, I noticed something odd. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed different. Their bark was darker, the patterns more intricate. And was it just my imagination, or did they lean in slightly, as if straining to get a better look at the newcomer? I shook my head, chuckling at my overactive writer's imagination. Get a grip, Liam, I muttered. They're just trees. That first day was peaceful enough. I settled in, unpacked my laptop, and tried to write. The words came slowly, but they came. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Maybe this place would be good for me after all. It was that night when things started to get weird. I woke up around 3 a.m., that liminal hour when the world feels thin and strange. At first, I thought it was the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old cabin that had disturbed me. But then I heard it. A soft, sibilant sound coming from outside. Curious, I padded to the window and peered out. The full moon bathed the clearing in silvery light, making the trees stand out in stark relief. And in that moment, I could have sworn I saw them moving. Not swaying in the wind, but actually shifting, their branches reaching towards the cabin like grasping fingers. And that sound, it wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It almost sounded like words. I slammed the curtains shut, my heart pounding. You're losing it, I told myself. It's just the isolation playing tricks on your mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I tried to focus on writing, but I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. My eyes kept drifting to the window, to those trees that now seemed to loom closer than ever. As evening approached, I decided to take a walk, hoping to clear my head. The forest path was dappled with late afternoon sunlight, the air filled with the chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. For a while, I almost managed to convince myself that everything was normal. Then I saw the symbols. They were carved into the trunk of an ancient oak, weathered with age, but still clearly visible. Swirling patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly, forming shapes that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't focusing on them. A chill ran down my spine. These weren't the work of some bored hiker or local kids. They were too intricate, too alien. As I stared, transfixed, the whispers started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Urgent, almost pleading. I ran back to the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hand shook as I poured myself a stiff drink, trying to rationalize what I'd seen and heard. That night, the whispers were impossible to ignore. They filled the cabin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, and now I could almost understand them. Almost, but not quite. It was like listening to a language I'd once known but had forgotten, the meaning hovering just out of reach. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. I sat up, groggy and disoriented. Had it all been a dream? Then I saw the scratches on the inside of the door, long, deep gouges in the wood, as if something with massive claws had been trying to get in, or trying to keep something out. My blood ran cold. I hadn't done that, which meant I approached the door cautiously, heart pounding. With trembling hands, I unlocked it and pulled it open. The clearing was gone. Where there had been open space, there was now a wall of trees. Massive, ancient things with bark-like twisted faces, pressing in so close I could have reached out and touched them. And they were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. Branches creaked and groaned, roots shifting beneath the earth. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, no longer just in my head but filling the air around me. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it as my mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Trees didn't move, didn't whisper. This had to be some kind of hallucination, a mental breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew it was real. All of it. I spent the day huddled in the cabin, alternating between frantic writing, pouring out everything that had happened, and staring out the windows at the ever-shifting forest beyond. As night fell, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And now, finally, I could understand them. "Help us," they said. "Free us." I pressed my hands against the window, feeling the glass vibrate with the force of their pleas. "How?" I whispered back. "What do you need me to do?" The answer came not in words, but in images that burned themselves into my brain. I saw the forest as it once was, vibrant and alive. I saw dark shapes moving among the trees, ancient and hungry. I saw a ritual performed beneath a blood-red moon that bound the forest and trapped something else, and I saw how to undo it. My hands moved of their own accord, grabbing a knife from the kitchen. I knew what I had to do, what the trees needed. I stepped outside, the knife glinting in the moonlight. The trees parted before me, forming a path that led deep into the heart of the forest. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, urging me on. At the center of it all stood an ancient oak, its trunk twisted into a shape that hurt to look at. The symbols I'd seen earlier covered every inch of its surface, glowing with an inner light. I knew what came next. The knife, my blood, the words that the trees had planted in my mind. As I raised the blade, a small part of me screamed that this was madness, that I was about to do something that couldn't be undone. But it was too late. I'd made my choice the moment I stepped out of the cabin. The knife bit deep. I barely felt the pain. The words poured from my mouth, ancient and terrible. The forest held its breath, and then, release. The world exploded into light and sound. The trees shuddered, their branches whipping wildly. The ground beneath my feet churned like a stormy sea. When it was over, I found myself lying on my back, staring up at a canopy of leaves that no longer seemed threatening. The whispers were gone. The forest was silent, but not empty. As I struggled to my feet, I saw them. Shapes moving among the trees, tall and lithe, and definitely not human. They approached slowly, their faces a blur of features I couldn't quite focus on. One of them reached out, long fingers brushing my cheek in what felt like gratitude. Then they were gone, melting back into the forest that was once again their home. I made my way back to the cabin in a daze. My laptop sat on the table where I'd left it, the screen filled with my frantic writings from earlier. With shaking hands, I added one final line. I freed them. God help me, I freed them. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Be careful in the deep woods. Listen to the whispers of the trees, because sometimes the forest keeps secrets. Ancient secrets, hungry secrets. And once they're free, there's no putting them back. As for me, I'm still here in the cabin. I can't leave now. I'm part of the forest, bound to it by blood and ancient words. And sometimes, late at night, I hear those whispers again, calling me, telling me there's more work to be done. And I listen, because that's what you do when the trees start to whisper. You listen, and you obey. Story 13. The first time I saw my doppelganger, I thought it was a trick of the light. The fifth time, I began to question my sanity. Now, I'm not sure which one of us is the real me anymore. My name's Emily, or at least I think it is. I used to be sure about things like that. Used to be sure about a lot of things, actually. But that was before the day I saw myself walking down the street. It was a Tuesday, I remember that, clearly. I was hurrying to catch the bus to work, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, when I glanced across the street and froze. There, waiting at the crosswalk, was me. Same shoulder-length brown hair, same green jacket, same beat-up messenger bag slung across her body. For a moment, I thought I was looking in a mirror. Then the light changed, and my double walked away, vanishing into the morning crowd. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It had to be a coincidence, right? Just someone who looked a lot like me. The city was full of brunettes in green jackets, after all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The resemblance had been too perfect, too uncanny. It was me, down to the small scar on my left cheek from a childhood accident. I was late to work that day, my mind spinning with possibilities. A twin sister I never knew about, some elaborate prank. Or was I finally cracking under the stress of my high-pressure job? I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on my work. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. I'd catch glimpses of her, of me, in crowds, reflected in store windows, always just at the edge of my vision. And each time, she'd vanish before I could get a closer look. It was driving me crazy. I started sleeping poorly, jumping at every reflection, scrutinizing the faces of passers-by. My co-workers noticed, shooting me concerned glances when they thought I wasn't looking. "You okay, Em?" My friend Sarah asked one day over lunch. "You seem on edge lately." I forced a smile. "Just stressed about the Anderson account," I lied. How could I explain what was really going on? That I kept seeing my own face staring back at me from places it shouldn't be. But things were about to get much, much worse. It was about a month after the first sighting when I got the text. Unknown number, but the message made my blood run cold. "I know you've seen me. We need to talk. Corner of 5th and Main, 8 p.m. tonight." My hands shook as I stared at the screen. This was it. A chance to finally get some answers. Or maybe to confirm that I had, in fact, lost my mind. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to run, to hide, I went. The streets were quiet as I approached the meeting spot, most of the office workers having headed home for the day. A few stragglers hurried past, collars turned up against the chill autumn wind. And there, leaning against a streetlight, was me. Seeing her, seeing myself, up close was surreal. It was like looking in a mirror, but a mirror that moved independently of my own actions. She smiled as I approached, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was my smile, but there was something off about it. Something cold. "Hello, Emily," she said, and even her voice was identical to mine. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Who? What are you?" She laughed, and the sound sent shivers through me. "I'm you, of course. The real you. The you there should have been." My mind reeled. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't," she said, her tone condescending. "You're just a placeholder. A stand-in until I was ready to take my rightful place." She stepped closer, and I had to fight the urge to back away. "You see, Emily, there was an accident when we were born. A mistake. They gave you my life, my family, my future. But now I'm here to take it back." I shook my head, trying to make sense of her words. "This is insane. You can't just replace me. People will know. My friends, my family, will they?" She interrupted, that cold smile still in place. "Haven't you noticed how distant they've been lately? How they look at you like you're a stranger? That's because, deep down, they know. They can sense that you're not the real Emily." And the worst part was, she was right. I had noticed. The concerned looks, the awkward pauses in conversation, the way my own parents had seemed almost uncomfortable around me during our last video call. At the time, I'd chalked it up to my own stress and odd behavior. But now, "What do you want from me?" I whispered, fear clawing at my throat. Her smile widened, and for a moment, I could have sworn her teeth looked sharper than they should be. "I want you to step aside, to fade away like you should have done years ago. I want my life back." I took a step back, then another. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I don't know who or what you are, but this is my life. You can't have it." She sighed, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, Emily, you don't have a choice." That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted down the street, heart pounding, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, gasping for breath, I slumped against a wall in an alley, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw the poster. My face stared back at me from the faded paper, the word "missing" stamped across the top in bold red letters. The date listed was 3 months ago. My head spun. 3 months ago, I'd been, where? Working, on vacation. I tried to remember, but my memories felt fuzzy, indistinct, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone. No service. The screen reflected my face, but as I stared, it seemed to shift, becoming less and less familiar. Who was I, really? I made my way home in a daze, jumping at every shadow. As I approached my apartment building, I saw her again. Standing in the lobby, chatting easily with my neighbor, Mrs. Shun. They were laughing about something, the old woman's face lit up with genuine warmth. I ducked out of sight, heart racing. This couldn't be happening. But as I peered around the corner, I saw my doppelganger enter my apartment, using my keys. Mrs. Chun waved goodbye, calling out, "Good night, Emily. So good to see you looking like yourself again." I slumped to the ground, mind reeling. Was I the imposter? Had I somehow stolen someone else's life, and now the universe was setting things right? For days, I wandered the city in a fog. I saw her, the other me, everywhere. At my job, laughing with my co-workers, having dinner with my friends, video chatting with my parents, who looked happier and more relaxed than they had in months. She slipped into my life seamlessly, filling all the spaces I'd apparently left vacant. And the more I saw her living my life, the less sure I became of my own existence. My memories began to fade, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. Who was I, if not Emily? What was I, if she was the real one? I'm writing this now from a small motel on the outskirts of town. My funds are running low, and I'm not sure how much longer I can stay here. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I don't recognize the face staring back at me. It shifts and blurs, never quite settling into a definite form. I see her sometimes, walking down the street or through the park. She always smiles and waves, as if we're old friends. And each time, I feel a little more of myself slip away. So if you're reading this, please, be careful. Look closely at the people around you, at yourself. Because sometimes, the person staring back at you from the mirror isn't who you think they are. Sometimes, there's something else entirely. Something that's been waiting a very long time to take your place. And once they do, there's no getting it back. As for me, I'm not sure how much longer I'll be me, but I know one thing. The next time I see her, the real Emily, the one who took my life, I won't run. I'll face her. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find out who I really am, or who I used to be. Story 14. The first time I heard the song, I thought it was beautiful. By the third time, I knew it was going to kill me. But let me start at the beginning, back when a rafting trip down the Colorado River seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. My name's Jake, and I've always been a thrill seeker. So when my buddy Mike suggested a week-long whitewater rafting expedition through the Grand Canyon, I was all in. Our group was small. Just me, Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and our guide, a grizzled old river rat named Tom. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. The rush of navigating rapids, the stunning beauty of the canyon walls towering above us, the peaceful nights camping under a blanket of stars. It was like being in another world, far removed from the noise and stress of everyday life. It was on the fourth day that things started to get weird. We'd just finished navigating a particularly gnarly set of rapids. Adrenaline still pumping through our veins when Sarah cocked her head to the side. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rush of the river. We all paused, listening. At first, all I could hear was the water and the occasional cry of a distant bird. But then, faintly, I caught it. A melody, hauntingly beautiful, seeming to come from upriver. "Probably just the wind playing tricks," Tom said, but there was an edge to his voice that made me uneasy. "Let's make camp. We've got a big day tomorrow." As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The song, if that's what it was, seemed to fade in and out. Sometimes so quiet I thought I was imagining it. Other times loud enough that I could almost make out words. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Mike brought it up again. "Seriously, what do you think that sound is?" "I've never heard anything like it." Tom poked at the fire, his weathered face unreadable in the flickering light. "There are lots of strange sounds in the canyon," he said slowly. Best not to pay them too much mind. But I could tell he was worried. And as I lay in my tent that night, sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, I heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, singing in a language I didn't recognize. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something else underneath. A longing, a hunger that made my skin crawl. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, Sarah was shaking me awake. Jake, wake up." "Mike's gone." I sat up, groggy and disoriented. "What do you mean, gone?" Tears streaked Sarah's face. I woke up and he wasn't in the tent. His sleeping bag is empty. We can't find him anywhere. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I scrambled out of the tent. Tom was already up, scanning the river with binoculars. "There," he shouted, pointing. In the early morning light, I could just make out a figure on the opposite bank. Mike, standing knee-deep in the water, staring upriver with a blank expression. We sprang into action, Tom and I manning the raft, while Sarah called out to Mike, but he didn't seem to hear us. As we got closer, I realized he was swaying slightly, as if moving to music only he could hear. Just as we were about to reach him, Mike turned and looked at us. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. And then, to our horror, he started walking deeper into the river. "Mike, no," Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The current caught him, sweeping him away before we could reach him. The next few hours were a blur of frantic searching and calls for help on our emergency radio. Search and rescue teams were mobilized, but as the day wore on, hope faded. Mike was gone, taken by the river. That night, huddled around a somber campfire, the song came again. Louder now, more insistent. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "It's her," she whispered. "She's calling him." Tom and I exchanged worried glances. The stress and grief were clearly getting to Sarah, but as the melody swelled, I felt it too. A pull, an urge to go to the river, to let it take me to wherever the song was coming from. I shook my head, trying to clear it. "We need to get out of here," I said. "First thing in the morning, we head back." Tom nodded grimly. "Agreed. Whatever's going on here, it ain't natural. But getting out wasn't going to be as easy as we thought. We woke to find our raft had come loose in the night, drifting just out of reach in a slow eddy. And no matter how we tried, we couldn't seem to snag it. "It's her," Sarah said, her voice flat. She doesn't want us to leave. I wanted to argue, to say she was being irrational. But deep down, I knew she was right. Something out there didn't want us to go. Something that sang with a voice like honey and poison. We spent the day trying to figure out a way upriver on foot, but the canyon walls were too steep, the terrain too treacherous. As night fell again, the song returned, stronger than ever. I could make out words now, or at least impressions of words. Promises of beauty, of peace, of an end to all pain and loneliness. All we had to do was come to her, to let the river take us into her embrace. Tom was the first to break. One moment he was sitting beside me, the next he was walking towards the water, a beatific smile on his face. Sarah and I tried to stop him, but it was like trying to move a mountain. He shrugged us off effortlessly, wading into the dark water. "Tom, please," I shouted. "Fight it." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I saw fear in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that same glassy-eyed serenity I'd seen in Mike. "Can't you hear how beautiful it is?" he said softly. "She's waiting for us. All of us." And then he was gone, swept away by the current. Sarah collapsed on the bank, sobbing. I held her, my own tears mixing with hers. But even in our grief, I could feel the song pulling at us, trying to draw us in. That night was the longest of my life. The song never stopped, growing louder and more seductive with each passing hour. Sarah and I clung to each other, fighting the urge to go to the water. We talked constantly, desperately, about anything and everything, trying to drown out the melody with our own voices. As dawn broke, I realized with horror that we'd drifted closer to the river in the night. The water lapped at our feet, cold and inviting. Sarah's eyes were wide, her breath coming in short gasps. "Jake," she whispered, "I don't think I can fight it much longer." I gripped her hand tightly. "We have to. Help will come. We just need to hold on." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. No help was coming. Not in time. The song had grown so loud, it drowned out all other sound, all other thought. It filled my head, my heart, promising an end to pain, to fear, to the very concept of loneliness. I saw Sarah stand, her movements jerky, as if she was fighting against her own body. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I have to go to her. She's calling me." I tried to hold her back, but my own strength was failing. The song pulled at me, urging me to let go, to follow Sarah into the water, to let the current take me to a place of eternal peace and beauty. As I write this, my feet are already in the water. The song is everything now, drowning out all other thought, all other sensation. I can see her just beneath the surface. A woman more beautiful than any I've ever seen, her arms outstretched, welcoming me home. I know now that this is how it was always meant to end, that from the moment we heard that first faint melody, our fates were sealed. The river has claimed us, as it has claimed so many others before. So if you're reading this, please, be careful. If you're ever in the Grand Canyon and you hear a song more beautiful than anything you've ever heard before, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because once you hear her call, it's already too late. The river is waiting, and she's hungry. Story 15. The first time I noticed the eyes in my photos, I thought it was a glitch in my camera. By the 10th time, I knew I was being hunted. But let me start at the beginning, back when a solo trip to capture the beauty of the wilderness seemed like a dream come true. I'm Sam, a wildlife photographer with a passion for the untamed and a stubborn streak a mile wide. When I got the chance to spend 2 weeks in the remote backcountry of Yellowstone, I jumped at it. Just me, my camera, and the raw beauty of nature. What could go wrong? The first few days were incredible. I captured shots of elk grazing in misty meadows at dawn, a grizzly fishing in a crystal clear stream, and the kind of sunsets that make you believe in a higher power. Each night, I'd review my day's work on my camera's small screen, marveling at the images I'd captured. It was on the fourth night that I first saw them. I was flicking through the day's shots when something caught my eye. In a photo of a dense stand of pines, barely visible in the shadows, were two pinpricks of light. Eyes reflecting the flash of my camera. I zoomed in, curious. Probably just a deer or coyote, I thought. But as the image resolved, I felt a chill run down my spine. The eyes were too large, too round to belong to any animal I knew, and they were looking directly at the camera, directly at me. I quickly flicked at the next photo, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but there they were again, this time in a shot of a babbling brook. Half hidden behind a boulder, those same unblinking eyes. My hands shook as I went through the rest of the photos. In every single one, somewhere in the background, were those eyes, watching, waiting. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of weird lens flare or a problem with my camera's sensor. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there, following me. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me bolt upright in my tent, heart pounding. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. As I packed up camp, I debated heading back to civilization, but my stubbornness kicked in. I wasn't going to let some weird photos and an overactive imagination ruin this trip. I'd come here to get amazing shots, and that's what I was going to do. So I pressed on, deeper into the wilderness. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I raised my camera to my eye, I half expected to see those glowing orbs staring back at me through the lens. That evening, as I set up camp near a small lake, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing. A low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but it was impossible to pin down. As quickly as it had come, it faded away, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. With shaking hands, I reviewed the day's photos. The eyes were there, as I knew they would be, but they were closer now, no longer hiding in deep shadows or behind obstacles. In one shot of the lake at sunset, I could make out a vague shape behind those glowing orbs. Something tall and thin, with too many limbs. I barely slept that night, the humming sound coming and going in waves. It was in my dreams too, visions of dark shapes moving just at the edge of my vision, always accompanied by that otherworldly thrumming. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to get out of here. Whatever was going on, it wasn't natural, and I wanted no part of it. I packed up quickly, planning to hike back to the ranger station. It would be a long trek, but better than staying out here with whatever that thing was. But as I shouldered my heavy pack and turned to leave, I froze. There, not 20 feet away, stood a deer. But something was terribly wrong. Its eyes were too big, too round, glowing with the same eerie light I'd seen in my photos. And its body. It looked almost hollow, like a deer-shaped shell with something else inside. I raised my camera on instinct, the shutter clicking rapidly. The deer thing didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Then, slowly, its mouth began to open, wider and wider, far beyond what should have been possible. And from deep inside came that humming sound, louder now, filling my head with its alien resonance. I ran. blind panic propelling me through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Only then did I dare to stop and look back. The forest behind me was still, no sign of pursuit, but that humming, it was all around me now, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. With trembling hands, I checked my camera. The photos I'd just taken showed the deer thing in horrifying detail. Its distorted body, the impossible angles of its limbs, and behind it, half hidden by trees, were more shapes. Tall, spindly figures with too many joints, their bodies seeming to shift and blur even in the still image. I don't know how long I walked after that. Hours blurred together, the sun arcing overhead and then dipping below the tree line. The humming never stopped, sometimes fading to a barely audible whisper, other times swelling until it was all I could hear. As night fell, I knew I was lost. Nothing looked familiar, and my phone's GPS had stopped working long ago. The battery on my camera was dying too, the screen flickering weakly as I flipped through the day's photos. They were all there, in every shot. No longer hiding, no longer just eyes in the shadows. Full figures now, captured in the backgrounds of landscapes and close-ups alike. Impossible bodies, faces that hurt to look at directly. And always, always those eyes, watching, waiting. I made camp that night out of sheer exhaustion, knowing sleep wouldn't come. The humming had taken on a rhythm now, almost like words in a language I couldn't understand. As I huddled in my tent, I could have sworn I heard movement outside. The soft crunch of footsteps on pine needles, the rustle of something brushing against the tent fabric. When dawn broke, I emerged to find my campsite surrounded by a perfect circle of those deer things. Dozens of them, standing motionless, their two large eyes fixed on me. Beyond them, half hidden in the trees, I could make out taller figures, waiting. My hand shook as I raised my camera one last time. If these were going to be my final moments, I was going to document them. The shutter clicked, and for a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the humming rose to a deafening roar, and the deer things began to move. Not towards me, but inward. Their bodies twisted and flowed, merging together into a writhing mass of flesh and glowing eyes. The taller figures emerged from the trees, their forms shifting and changing with each step. I watched, paralyzed with terror, as they drew closer. In that moment, I understood. They weren't just watching me. They were studying me, learning, and now they were ready to become me. The last thing I saw before the mass of twisted flesh engulfed me was my own face, reflected in a sea of glowing eyes. But it wasn't quite right. The angles were off, the expression a grotesque approximation of a human smile. I'm not sure how long it's been since then. Time doesn't work the same way here, in this place between places. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the world I knew. A familiar forest path, a campsite, a hiker raising a camera to capture the beauty of nature. And sometimes I see through different eyes. Eyes that glow in the shadows of photographs, watching and waiting for the next unwary soul to wander too deep into the wilderness. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Be careful what you capture on camera when you're out in nature, because sometimes, when you think you're the one doing the watching, you're really the one being watched. And once they've seen you, once they've learned you, they'll come for you too. Just like they came for me. Look closely at your photos. Do you see the eyes watching you? They're coming, and they're hungry for new shapes to wear. Story 16. I never thought I'd be afraid of my own voice. But as I stand here, throat raw from screaming, Listening to the mountains mock me with my own words, I realized that some echoes are better left unheard. My name's Alex, and I've always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. So when my buddy Mike suggested we check out this remote valley known for its incredible echoes, I was all in. Echo Valley, the locals called it. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Rockies, it was supposed to be a natural wonder. If only we'd known what we were really walking into. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and the world feels sharp and new. The hike was tough, but the scenery was worth it. Towering pines, crystal clear streams, and glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. As we climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and an eerie stillness settled over the landscape. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crunch of our boots on the rocky trail and our labored breathing. Kinda quiet up here, huh? Mike said, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. I nodded, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. Yeah, it's weird. You'd think there'd be more wildlife. We rounded a bend, and suddenly the valley opened up before us. It was breathtaking. A vast, bowl-shaped depression surrounded by sheer cliff faces. The floor of the valley was a patchwork of meadows and stands of gnarled, wind-twisted trees. This is it, Mike said, grinning. Echo Valley. Ready to give it a try. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted, "Hello!" The sound bounced off the cliff faces, coming back to us, magnified and distorted. Hello, hello, hello. But there was something off about it. The echo didn't fade as it should have. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, more insistent with each repetition. Mike laughed, oblivious to my unease. That's wild. Let me try. He let out a whoop that reverberated through the valley. But as the echo came back to us, I could have sworn it changed. The pitch shifted, the tone warped, until it sounded less like Mike and more like something else. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike cocked his head, listening as the last echoes died away. Hear what? I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over me. Nothing, never mind. Let's set up camp. We found a relatively flat spot near a stand of twisted pines and started setting up our tent. As I hammered in the stakes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing up at the surrounding cliffs, half expecting to see figures silhouetted against the sky, but there was never anything there. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, we built a small fire and settled in for the night. The flames cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance and writhe at the edge of our little circle of light. So, Mike said, poking at the fire with a stick, ghost stories. Seems appropriate, given the creepy vibes of this place. I forced a laugh. Nah, man. I think this place is plenty creepy without adding any ghost stories to the mix. Mike raised an eyebrow. Come on, don't tell me you're scared of a little echo. I'm not scared, I said, perhaps a bit too quickly. It's just, doesn't something feel off to you? Like we're not alone out here? He shrugged. It's the wilderness, dude. We're probably not alone. Plenty of critters out there. But I knew that wasn't it. The feeling I had wasn't about animals. It was something else. Something old and patient and hungry. As if to prove my point, a sound drifted across the valley. A low, mournful cry that might have been the wind if the air hadn't been perfectly still. Mike sat up straighter, his eyes wide. What was that? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the sound came again. Louder this time, and unmistakably a voice. My voice. Help me, it called. the words distorted and stretched. "Please, someone help me." Mike scrambled to his feet, nearly kicking over the fire in his haste. "What the fuck, Alex? Is this some kind of joke?" I shook my head, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "It's not me, Mike. I swear to God, it's not me." The voice came again, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mike, where are you? I'm lost. I'm so lost." Mike's face had gone pale, his eyes darting around the darkened valley. "This isn't funny, man. Cut it out. It's not me," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. And as if in response, the valley erupted with sound. Dozens, hundreds of voices, all mine, all Mike's, calling out in terror, in pain, in mocking laughter. We ran, grabbing what we could from the campsite. We bolted for the trail that had led us into this nightmare. But in the darkness, with the cacophony of our own voices hounding us, we quickly became lost. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to warp and stretch in Echo Valley. We stumbled through meadows, fought our way through thickets of those twisted trees, and always, the voices followed. They weren't just echoes anymore. They were conversations, arguments, pleas for help. I heard myself confessing secrets I'd never told anyone, revealing fears I'd buried deep. Mike's voice joined in, sometimes speaking to the phantom me, sometimes crying out in terror. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, we found ourselves back at our campsite. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a feeble glow over our abandoned gear. Mike collapsed to his knees, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. "What's happening, Alex? What is this place?" I shook my head, unable to form words. That's when I saw them. Figures moving at the edge of the fading firelight. They looked like us. Like me, like Mike, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them stepped forward, and I had to bite back a scream. It was me, but not me. A twisted, elongated version of my face stretched over a frame that was almost skeletal. When it spoke, it was with my voice, but layered over itself a dozen times. "Welcome home," it said, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. "We've been waiting for you." Mike scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror. No, he moaned. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But it was. As the sun crested the eastern cliffs, flooding the valley with pale light, I saw the truth of Echo Valley. The twisted trees weren't trees at all, but petrified figures frozen in poses of terror and agony. The rocks were studded with faces, mouths open in silent screams. Echo Valley wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, ancient and hungry, and we had walked right into its maw. The thing that looked like me reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long and jointed in all the wrong places. "Don't you want to stay?" it asked, my own voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't you want to become part of something greater?" And God help me, part of me did. I could feel the valley's pull, the seductive whisper promising an end to loneliness, to fear, to the very concept of self. All I had to do was let go, to add my voice to the eternal chorus of Echo Valley. Mike's scream snapped me out of it. He was being dragged towards one of the petrified figures, his body already beginning to twist and elongate. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm and ran. We crashed through the underbrush, the voices rising to a deafening roar behind us. Somehow, miraculously, we found the trail. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. not daring to stop until we'd put miles between us and that accursed valley. It's been weeks now, and I still wake up screaming some nights, my own voice echoing in my ears. Mike won't talk about what happened. Won't talk much at all, really. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. The whispers, the pleas, the mocking laughter. My voice calling me back to Echo Valley. So if you're ever hiking in the Rockies and you hear about a place known for its incredible echoes, turn back. Don't listen to its call. Because in Echo Valley, every shout, every whisper, every secret fear you've ever had is waiting to be given voice. And once it has your voice, it never lets go. Story 17. The first time our kayaks vanished, we laughed it off as a prank. By the third time, we knew the island didn't want us to leave. But let me start at the beginning, back when a weekend getaway to a secluded island seemed like the perfect escape. I'm Megan, and I've always loved the water. So when my girlfriend, Jen, suggested we take our kayaks out to Whisper Island for a camping trip, I was all in. The island was just a tiny speck on the map, about 2 miles off the coast of Maine. No ferry service, no residents, just pristine nature and solitude. Perfect, right? We set out early on a Saturday morning, the sea calm and glassy under a hazy summer sun. Our kayaks cut through the water smoothly, loaded down with camping gear and enough food for a long weekend. As we paddled, the mainland slowly shrank behind us, and a Whisper Island grew from a smudge on the horizon to a green jewel rising from the sea. "Race you to the beach," Jen called out, her paddle quickening. I grinned and matched her pace, the exertion warming me against the cool ocean spray. We beached our kayaks on a narrow strip of sand, dragging them well above the tide line. The island rose steeply from the shore, densely forested with old-growth pines that blocked out most of the sky. The air was thick with the scent of salt and evergreen, and strangely still. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the soft lapping of waves on the shore. "It's so quiet," I murmured, a shiver running down my spine despite the warm day. Jen nodded, her eyes scanning the treeline. "Yeah, it's peaceful." But there was an edge to her voice that made me wonder if she felt it too. A sort of pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. We found a clearing about 100 yards inland and set up camp. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, peering at us from between the trees. But there was never anything there. As the sun began to set, we built a small fire and settled in for the night. The flames cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of our little circle of light, taking on shapes that were almost, but not quite, human. "Tell me a ghost story," Jen said, snuggling closer to me. Her tone was light, but I could feel the tension in her body. I forced a laugh. "I don't think this place needs any help being creepy, babe." As if in response, a sound drifted through the trees. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing, that might have been the wind if the air hadn't been perfectly still. Jen sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Probably just the waves," I said, not believing it for a second. We turned in early that night, both of us on edge. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with strange dreams. I saw the island from above, its shape not the irregular oval on our maps, but something more deliberate. A spiral, drawing inward to a dark center hidden beneath the canopy. I woke with a start, heart pounding. The tent was filled with a pale, pre-dawn light. Beside me, Jen was still asleep, her face troubled, even in repose. As quietly as I could, I unzipped a tent and stepped outside. The clearing was filled with mist, tendrils of it curling around my ankles like curious animals. I made my way down to the beach, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. The sand was empty. Our kayaks, which we'd left well above the high tide line, were gone. I stood there for a long moment, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. The tide hadn't been nearly high enough to reach them, and even if it had, there was no way it could have taken both boats without leaving any trace. "Jen!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the still morning air. "Jen, wake up!" She came stumbling out of the woods a few minutes later, her hair mussed from sleep. "What's wrong? Why are you yelling?" Wordlessly, I pointed to the empty beach. Jen's eyes widened, her face palling. That's not possible," she whispered. We spent the next few hours combing the shoreline, hoping against hope that we'd somehow missed them. But there was no sign of our kayaks. It was as if they'd never existed. "Okay," Jen said finally, running a hand through her hair. "Okay, this is fine. We've got the emergency radio. We'll just call for help," and she stopped mid-sentence, her face going even paler. The radio was in my kayak. The full weight of our situation hit me like a physical blow. We were stranded on an uninhabited island with no way to call for help. Our food and most of our water had been in the kayaks too. All we had was what we'd brought to the campsite: a couple of water bottles, some snack bars, and our tent. "Someone must have taken them," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Maybe there are other campers on the island. Or poachers, or something." Jen nodded, latching onto the idea. "Right, we'll hike around the island, see if we can find them. And if we can't, we'll build a signal fire. Someone will see it from the mainland." But as we set out to circumnavigate the island, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. More than once, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. And always that whisper on the wind. Sometimes it sounded like laughter, sometimes like crying. Once, horribly, I thought I heard my own voice calling out in terror. We made it about halfway around the island, before the sun began to set. With no other choice, we made our way back to our campsite. The clearing seemed smaller somehow, the trees having crept closer while we were gone. That night, the whispers grew louder. They were clearly voices now, calling out to us, begging us to join them. I clung to Jen, both of us shaking, neither of us sleeping. When dawn broke, we stumbled out of the tent, exhausted and on edge. And there, on the beach, were our kayaks, sitting exactly where we'd left them, as if they'd never been gone. We didn't question it, didn't even speak. We just grabbed our gear and ran for the boats, desperate to get off this nightmare island. But as we pushed off from shore, the whispers rose to a fever pitch. The water around us began to churn, waves coming from all directions at once. I saw Jen's kayak tip, heard her scream as she went under. I reached for her, my fingertips just brushing hers, before she was pulled away. I screamed her name, fighting against the waves, but it was no use. In moments, both Jen and her kayak had vanished beneath the roiling sea. My own kayak flipped then, plunging me into the icy water. I kicked and thrashed, fighting to reach the surface. But something had holded me, pulling me down into the dark. Just before my lungs gave out, before the blackness took me, I saw it. The true shape of Whisby Island, revealed beneath the waves. Not an island at all, but something vast and ancient and hungry. Its maw opened wide, ready to swallow me whole. I woke up on the beach, coughing up seawater. Jen was beside me, pale and shaking, but alive. Our kayaks sat innocently on the sand, as if nothing had happened. We've tried to leave 7 times now. Each time, the island takes our boats. Each time, we wake up back on the beach. We're running out of food, out of water, out of hope. The whispers are constant now. They tell us it's easier if we just give in. If we just accept that we're part of the island now. Part of its endless, hungry dream. I don't know how much longer we can resist. Already, I can feel myself changing. This morning, I found pine needles growing from my skin. Jen's eyes have taken on the deep, fathomless blue of the sea that surrounds us. So if you're reading this, please, stay away from Whisper Island. Don't let its siren call lure you in. Because once you set foot on its shores, you'll never truly leave. And if you see 2 kayaks, abandoned on a lonely stretch of Maine coastline, just walk away. We're already gone. We've always been here. And we're so hungry for company. Story 18. The first time the campfire spoke to us, we thought it was a clever trick. By the 3rd time, we knew we were fighting for our souls. But let me start at the beginning, back when a Boy Scout camping trip seemed like a wholesome weekend activity. I'm Dave, an assistant scoutmaster for Troop 237. When our scoutmaster, Bill, suggested we take the boys to Whispering Pines campground for our annual fall trip, I was all for it. The place had a reputation for beautiful hiking trails and excellent stargazing. What I didn't know then was that it also had a reputation for something far more sinister. We arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon, the air thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke. As we set up our tents in the group campsite, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The forest around us seemed too quiet, the shadows between the trees too deep. "Hey Dave," called Tommy, one of our younger scouts. "Check this out." I walked over to where he was standing, staring at the fire pit. The ashes from previous campers had been arranged into strange, swirling patterns. Not random at all, but deliberate. "Huh," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Looks like someone got creative with their cleanup." But as I studied the patterns, I felt a chill run down my spine. They seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them, forming shapes that hurt my brain to comprehend. Bill's voice snapped me out of my reverie. "All right, boys, let's get that fire going. We've got some ghost stories to tell." As darkness fell, we gathered around the crackling campfire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the faces of the scouts, their eyes wide with excitement and a touch of fear as Bill launched into a classic tale of a hook-handed killer. That's when I first noticed it. A flicker in the flames, a shape that didn't quite match the random dance of fire. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a face in the embers, its mouth opening as if to speak. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself. Too many ghost stories. But then Tommy, who was sitting across from me, went rigid. His eyes, reflecting the firelight, grew impossibly wide. Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. The other boys looked at him, confused. "Hear what?" asked Mike, our oldest scout. Tommy swallowed hard. "The fire it said my name." A nervous titter ran through the group. Bill chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Looks like someone's getting a little too into the spirit of things. Maybe we should call it a night, boys." As the scouts headed to their tents, I pulled Bill aside. "Did you see anything weird in the fire?" I asked, feeling foolish, even as the words left my mouth. Bill raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" I shook my head. "Never mind. It's nothing." But as I lay in my tent that night, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next day passed uneventfully. We hiked, we did some wilderness training, we laughed. By the time evening rolled around, the unease from the night before had almost faded. Almost. As we gathered around the campfire again, I noticed Tommy hanging back, his face pale in the flickering light. "You okay, bud?" I asked. He nodded, but his eyes never left the flames. Just don't want to sit too close," he mumbled. I was about to press further when Bill called for everyone's attention. "All right, who's ready for some s'mores?" The mood lightened as we passed around marshmallows and chocolate. But as I was helping little Joey assemble his s'more, I heard it. A voice coming from the fire itself. "For ye'd use," it hissed, the words hidden in the crackle and pop of burning wood. I jerked back, nearly dropping my marshmallow stick. Around the circle, I saw other faces registering shock and confusion. So I wasn't the only one who had heard it. "What was that?" Mike asked, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, the fire flared up, impossibly high, and in the heart of the flames, I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, writhing and twisting. Their mouths opened in silent screams, eyes pleading. "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered beside me. The voices came again, louder now. "Feed us. Feed us," Tommy screamed, scrambling backwards. His movements seemed to break the spell, and suddenly everyone was yelling, trying to get away from the fire. "Everyone, calm down," I shouted, trying to restore order. But my own heart was racing, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The fire died down as quickly as it had flared, leaving us in near darkness. For a long moment, the only sounds were harsh breathing and muffled sobs. "It's okay," Bill said, his voice shaky but determined. "It's okay, everyone. Just go to your tents. We'll figure this out in the morning." But as the scouts filed away, I grabbed Bill's arm. "We can't stay here," I hissed. "Whatever that was," he cut me off. "We can't leave in the dark. It's not safe. We'll pack up at first light." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. The forest around us suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers, far worse than whatever we'd seen in the fire. That night was the longest of my life. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. And always, just on the edge of hearing, I could swear I heard voices whispering, calling, hungry. When dawn finally broke, it was a relief. We roused the boys, trying to project a calm we didn't feel. "Change of plans, guys," Bill announced. "We're heading out early." As we packed up, I noticed Tommy staring at the fire pit. The ashes had rearranged themselves again, forming a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. "Don't look at it," I said sharply, turning him away. We were almost finished packing when Joey let out a yelp. "My backpack, it's gone." A quick search revealed that it wasn't just Joey's pack. Equipment was missing from every tent. Sleeping bags, food, water bottles, all gone without a trace. And then we heard it. The crackle of a fire coming from the pit we had so carefully extinguished. We turned as one to see flames leaping up, higher than any natural fire should burn. And in those flames, we saw our missing gear, twisting and melting. "Feed us," the fire roared, no longer trying to hide its voice. "Feed us or join us." The faces were back, more numerous now. And with a jolt of horror, I recognized some of them. The missing hikers from last year's news reports. The family that had vanished from this very campground decades ago. "Run," I shouted, grabbing the nearest scouts and pushing them towards the trail. We ran, blind panic driving us forward. Behind us, I could hear the roar of the fire, the crack of falling trees. The entire forest seemed to be coming alive, hungry and furious at its escaping prey. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. But finally, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line onto the main road. As we stood there, gasping for breath, I looked back. Whispering Pines campground was hidden behind a veil of trees, looking peaceful and inviting in the morning light. No sign of the inferno we had fled, no evidence of our terrifying ordeal. But I knew the truth. And as I watched, I saw a tendril of smoke rise from the trees, twisting into a shape that looked disturbingly like a beckoning hand. We never spoke about what happened that weekend. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can still hear those voices, calling, hungry, waiting. So if you're ever camping and the fire starts to look a little too lively, a little too aware, don't hesitate. Don't wait, just run. Because once it starts speaking, once it shows you the faces of those it's taken before, it's already too late. And whatever you do, don't feed the fire, because it's always, always hungry for more. Story 19. The first time the fog rolled in, I thought it was just a quirk of the weather. By the third time, I knew we were trapped in something far more sinister than mere mist. But let me start at the beginning, back when a day hike through Raven's Hollow seemed like a great way to clear my head. I'm Sarah, and I've always loved the outdoors. So when my best friend Mike suggested we check out this new trail he'd heard about, I jumped at the chance. We'd both been stressed with work lately, and a day in nature sounded perfect. The morning started beautifully. The air was crisp with the promise of fall, leaves just starting to turn gold at the edges. As we set out on the trail, sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with warm patches of light. "Man, this is exactly what I needed," Mike said, taking a deep breath. "You can almost feel the stress melting away, you know?" I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, it's perfect. How'd you hear about this place again?" Mike's brow furrowed slightly. "You know, I'm not sure. I think maybe I saw it online somewhere." I shrugged it off, but something about his uncertainty nagged at me. It was so unlike Mike to forget details like that. We'd been hiking for about an hour when I first noticed the change in the air. A faint mist began to gather around our feet, tendrils of it curling up from the ground like curious fingers. "Ha, fog's rolling in," I commented, trying to keep my tone light despite the sudden unease in my stomach. Mike glanced around, frowning. Weird. It was supposed to be clear all day. The fog thickened rapidly, swirling around us in ever denser clouds. Within minutes, visibility had dropped to just a few feet. The warm sunlight that had been filtering through the trees was gone, replaced by a diffuse, greyish glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the thick air. Mike nodded, already turning around. But as we tried to retrace our steps, nothing looked familiar. The trail that had been clear just moments ago was now impossible to discern in the all-encompassing whiteness. "This is crazy," Mike muttered, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We couldn't have gotten turned around that fast, could we?" I was about to respond when I saw it. A shape in the fog, just at the edge of visibility. It looked like a person, standing perfectly still. "Hey!" I called out, relief flooding through me. "Can you help us? We've lost the trail." But as the figure turned towards us, that relief curdled into icy dread. Its movements were wrong, somehow, too fluid, almost boneless. And its face. I couldn't focus on its face. Every time I tried, my vision would blur, my mind recoiling from what it was seeing. "Mike," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "We need to go." Now, he must have seen it too, because he didn't argue. We turned and ran, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the fog. Not footsteps, but a sound like wet cloth being dragged over leaves. We ran until our lungs burned, until the stitch in my side felt like a knife. Finally, gasping for breath, we stopped in a small clearing. The fog was thinner here, and for a moment, I dared to hope we'd escaped. That's when we saw the stones. 7 of them, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the clearing. Each was covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. "What the hell is this place?" Mike breathed, his face pale in the dim light. Before I could answer, a sound drifted through the fog. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing, that might have been the wind if the air hadn't been perfectly still. "Welcome," it seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you." The fog closed in again, thicker than ever. I reached for Mike's hand, desperate for some human contact in this nightmare. But my fingers closed on empty air. "Mike!" I called out, my voice rising in panic. "Mike, where are you?" No answer. Just that whisper again, now seeming to come from all around me. "Join us," it said. "Become one with the mist." I ran again, blind terror propelling me forward. The fog parted and closed around me, revealing tantalizing glimpses of the forest before swallowing them up again. Sometimes I thought I saw figures in the mist, twisted, elongated shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this grey, featureless world. But suddenly, miraculously, I burst out of the fog bank and found myself back on the main trail. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and there was no sign of the mist that had nearly swallowed me whole. If it wasn't for my mud-caked shoes and the scratches on my arms from crashing through the underbrush, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. "Mike," I called out, hope and dread warring in my chest. "Mike, are you out here?" No answer. I waited for hours, alternating between calling for Mike and trying to get a signal on my phone to call for help. But there was nothing. No sign of Mike, no cell service, not even the sound of other hikers on the trail. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't be here when night fell, when the fog might return. The police, when I finally reached them, were sympathetic but skeptical. They searched the area but found no sign of Mike or anything unusual. Just a normal stretch of forest. They chalked it up to us getting separated, suggested that Mike had probably found his way out and gone home, but I knew the truth. I'd seen the things in the mist, heard their whispers, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear them. Calling, beckoning, hungry for more. It's been months now, and I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the taste of fog in my mouth. I've tried to go back, to find Mike or at least some answers. But Raven's Hollow isn't on any maps. The trailhead we used that day has vanished, replaced by an unbroken line of trees. Sometimes, when the weather's just right, I see tendrils of mist curling around street corners or seeping out from under doors. And in those moments, I swear I can see shapes moving in the fog. Familiar shapes. Mike's shape. They're still out there, waiting in the mist. Waiting for more lost hikers to stumble into their realm. Waiting to welcome them home. So if you're ever out hiking and a strange fog rolls in, turn back. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't look at the shapes in the mist. Just run and pray you find your way out before the fog finds you. Because once it has you, it never lets go. And a part of you will always be lost in the mist. Forever wandering through a world of endless grey, searching for a way home that no longer exists. As for me, I'm still searching for Mike, still hoping that one day I'll find a way back into that foggy realm and bring him home. But deep down, I know the truth. The fog has him now, and one day it will come for me too. I can feel it waiting, patient and hungry, just beyond the veil of everyday reality. And when it does, I'll be ready. Because maybe, just maybe, getting lost in the fog is the only way to truly find what I'm looking for. So if you see a strange mist rolling in, thicker and more alive than any natural fog, think of me and run. Run while you still can. Before the whispers start, before the shapes appear, before the fog welcomes you home. Story 20. The first time I opened a door and found myself back where I started, I thought I was going crazy. By the 100th time, I realized the cabin was trying to drive me insane. But let me start at the beginning, back when a secluded writer's retreat seemed like the perfect cure for my creative block. I'm Claire, a novelist with a looming deadline and a serious case of writer's block. When my agent suggested I rent a remote cabin to focus on finishing my book, it sounded like exactly what I needed. The recursive cabin, the listing called it. Quaint name, I thought. If only I'd known how horrifyingly literal it would turn out to be. The drive up was beautiful, all winding mountain roads and breathtaking vistas. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The place was picture perfect. A cozy A-frame nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The scent of wood smoke and pine needles filled the air. I lugged my suitcase up to the porch, fumbling with the keys the rental agency had sent. As I pushed open the heavy wooden door, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off, but I shook it off, blaming it on nerves and too much gas station coffee. The interior was even cozier than I'd imagined. Exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a wall of windows looking out into the forest. Perfect. I'd have this book finished in no time. I spent that first day settling in, unpacking my laptop and notes, getting a fire going in the fireplace. As night fell, I curled up on the plush sofa with a glass of wine, ready to dive into writing. That's when I noticed the first oddity. The cabin seemed bigger on the inside than it had looked from outside. The living room stretched on longer than it should have, the corners fading into shadows that didn't quite make sense. I rubbed my eyes, blaming the wine and the flickering firelight. Get it together, Claire, I muttered to myself. You came here to write, not to let your imagination run wild. Single quote. If only I'd listened to that imagination. I woke the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through the windows. Feeling refreshed, I decided to explore the cabin properly. That's when things started to get weird. I opened the door to what I thought was a hallway closet, only to find myself stepping into an exact copy of the living room I'd just left. Same sofa, same fireplace, same view out the windows. But this room had a door on the opposite wall that hadn't been there before. What the hell? I whispered, my heart starting to race. I turned back, but the door I'd come through had vanished. Swallowing my panic, I crossed to the new door and opened it, half expecting to find myself back in the original living room. Instead, I walked into a kitchen, but not the small, rustic kitchen I'd seen yesterday. This one was massive, industrial-sized, with gleaming stainless steel appliances stretching as far as I could see. The far end faded into a haze, like a fog had rolled in indoors. I slammed the door shut, breathing hard. This couldn't be happening. I was dreaming, or hallucinating, or... A sound behind me made me whirl around. The living room had changed again. The sofa was now an antique fainting couch, the fireplace a Victorian monstrosity of carved marble, and the windows. The windows showed a cityscape of impossible skyscrapers, twisting into the clouds like something out of a fever dream. I ran for the front door, desperate to get out of this nightmare house. But when I yanked it open, I found myself stepping right back into the same warped living room. "No," I moaned, sinking to my knees. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But it was, and it was only the beginning. For what felt like hours, I wandered through an endless maze of rooms. Each door led to another impossible space. Ballrooms with ceilings lost in shadow. Libraries where the books whispered as I passed. Kitchens that looked like they hadn't been used in centuries. Dust-covered dishes still set out for a meal that would never be served. And always, I'd eventually find myself back in that twisted version of the living room. Sometimes it was exactly as I'd left it. Other times it had changed in subtle, horrifying ways. Once, all the furniture was on the ceiling. Another time, I opened the door to find it flooded knee-deep in dark, brackish water. I lost track of time. Had it been hours, days? There were no clocks in this place, and the view out the windows changed with each iteration of the room. Sometimes it was day, sometimes night. Once, terrifyingly, it showed nothing but a field of stars, as if the cabin was floating in deep space. My phone was dead. My watch had stopped. I was hungry, thirsty, exhausted, but I was afraid to eat or drink anything I found in this place. Afraid to sleep, for fear of what the cabin might become while I was unconscious. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I opened a door and found my laptop, sitting on a desk that hadn't been there before, screen glowing invitingly. With shaking hands, I sat down and opened my manuscript. The document was blank except for one line of text. "Write your way out." A hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest. Of course, this was all about the writing. Wasn't that why I'd come here in the first place? So I began to write. I poured out everything that had happened to me, every impossible room, every mind-bending sight. I wrote about my fear, my confusion, my growing certainty that I was losing my mind. As I wrote, I began to notice changes in the room around me. With each paragraph, each page, the twisted wrongness began to fade. The furniture shifted back to normal. The windows once again showed the peaceful forest outside. I wrote for what felt like days, stopping only when my fingers were too cramped to continue. And when I finally looked up from the screen, I was back in the original cabin. The cozy, normal cabin I'd first walked into. Hesitantly, I stood up and walked to the front door. It opened onto the porch, the gravel driveway beyond. My car sat where I'd left it, covered in a light dusting of snow. How long had I been in here? I wanted to run, to jump in my car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But something stopped me. A nagging feeling that it wasn't over, that I hadn't quite solved the puzzle. I turned back to my laptop. The document I'd been working on was gone. In its place was a new file titled The Recursive Cabin. My novel, complete. With trembling fingers, I began to read. It was the story of a writer who comes to a secluded cabin and becomes trapped in an endless loop of impossible rooms. But as I read further, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just my story. There were other characters, other writers who had come to this cabin over the years. All of them trapped, all of them riding their way out. And with each story, each escape, the cabin grew. New rooms added, new impossibilities stacked on top of each other. I was just the latest in a long line of unwitting creators, adding my own nightmares to the ever-growing labyrinth. As I reached the final page, a chill ran down my spine. There, at the very end, was a note. Not from me, not from any of the other trapped writers. From the cabin itself. "Thank you for your contribution," it read. "We look forward to the next visitor. Perhaps you'd like to recommend our lovely writer's retreat to a friend." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. I grabbed my keys and ran for the car, not even bothering to pack. As I peeled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cavern shimmed in the afternoon light, looking for all the world like a quaint, inviting writer's retreat. Perfect for someone struggling with writer's block. I never told anyone what really happened during those lost days. How could I? But sometimes, when I'm struggling with a story, I feel a pull. A whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to return to the cabin, to add just one more room to its endless halls. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the sound of a typewriter clacking away in the next room. But when I open the door to look, there's nothing there. Just another room, waiting to be filled with someone else's nightmares. So if you're a writer struggling with a stubborn story, and you hear about a secluded cabin that's perfect for breaking through creative blocks, think twice. Because some stories don't want to be written. Some stories want to write you,